These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at cozyearth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at hartmanreport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at dinovite.com.
Today we're reading about Thunderdome politics, an uncivil war taking back our democracy in an age of Trumpian disinformation and Thunderdome politics by Greg Sargent, the Washington Post columnist. This is from his chapter on voter suppression. It's page 37. Republicans and Democrats inhabit different political realities, as mentioned in a previous chapter. But there are certain facts about our politics that are just objectively true. One of them is this. Generally speaking, efforts to make it harder to vote are almost always pushed by Republicans. You cannot understand what is happening in American politics right now without recognizing this stark and very fundamental difference between the two major political parties. During this decade, procedural hurdles were put into place in around 20 states that in some manner or other have made it harder to vote or to register to vote, or have undone previous efforts to make voting or registering easier, or have otherwise threatened serious disenfranchisement. Most of them were the creation of Republican lawmakers and officials. The difference in the two parties' national platforms for 2016 tells the story. The GOP platform champions additional hurdles that are absurdly disproportionate to the phantom abuse it alleges, while the Democratic platform champions multiple specific ways to make it easier to vote, not harder. The most common and controversial of methods used by Republicans to suppress Democratic turnout is the requirement that would-be voters present identification at the polls. The game here tends to turn on requiring forms of ID that some groups are less likely to have, making participation harder for them. Other restrictions include techniques like cutting back on early voting and making it harder to register, both of which have, in recent years, been instituted in multiple states. Republicans who have passed laws making it harder to vote have tended to claim such measures are necessary to protect against, quote, voter fraud. We'll look at this in more detail below, but for now, note that most of the states that have passed such measures did so while under Republican control. As New York University political scientist Samuel Isikoff has memorably put it, the single predictor necessary to determine whether a state will impose voter access restrictions is whether Republicans control the ballot access process. Scholars trace the modern era of warfare over election rules to the intensely contested presidential election of 2000. In which a divided Supreme Court halted the recount in Florida, throwing the presidency to George W. Bush. The closeness and partisan acrimony of that contest, combined with the intense national focus on election rules that accompanied the court battle over it, helped persuade both parties to invest much more attention and energy on those rules. As a result, both the implementation of measures restricting the ballot and the legal battles over them have intensified in recent years. A brief glance at the surprising history of voter ID laws begins to tell the story of this tightening. In the 1970s, several states implemented voter ID measures, but all of them provided for ways that voters without the proper ID could cast a ballot. By 2000, there were 14 such laws, and they had been implemented by politicians in both parties. But by the mid-2000s, amid rising post-2000 acrimony, a handful of red states began implementing voter ID laws that the nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures described as, quote, strict, meaning that they make it easy to disqualify those who don't pass muster. After one of those laws in Indiana was challenged and then upheld in 2008 by the Supreme Court, an escalation began that gained momentum in the Obama era. From 2010 onward, the adoption of voter ID laws in general, and of strict ones in particular, accelerated. Though a handful were blocked in the courts, as of this writing, a total of 34 states have voter ID laws in effect, 24 that are deemed non-strict and 10 that are deemed strict. The strict ones are in red states or in swing states where they were implemented by Republicans. The story is very similar if you evaluate the state's voting rules in a broader way, by including not just voter ID measures, but also cutbacks to early voting and restrictions on registration. Here the trend is just as pronounced. After the 2010 elections, the Brennan Center for Justice documented a sharp rise in efforts to pass such measures in the state legislatures across the country. Not all these efforts bore fruit, but many did. By the time voting took place in Election Day 2016, some 14 states had these new restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election. Now, as of this writing, by the Brennan Center's count, some 20 states have successfully implemented either strict voting ID requirements or cutbacks to early voting or restrictions on registration or other measures with meaningful disenfranchising effects. If you're a liberal who's frustrated by the seemingly unbreakable Republican dominance of national politics, not to mention GOP control of most state governments across the country, then the chances are that these restrictions figure heavily into your explanation of this GOP supremacy. Indeed, social media has been absolutely saturated in recent years with variations of the lament that Republican political dominance is largely maintained through a combination of nefarious and undemocratic tactics, such as ballot restrictions that keep constituencies unfriendly to the GOP from voting, and extreme gerrymanders that have, in effect, built a fortress around the GOP's majority in the House of Representatives. Democrats frequently invoke the GOP's use of these tactics, often justifiably, to raise money and to galvanize turnout. This narrative contains some important truths. Some of the forms that these restrictions on voting access have taken in recent years are diabolically obvious in their efforts to keep constituencies supportive of Democrats from voting. Still others boast the distinction of being more insidiously designed and thus less obvious in their intentions. The book is An Uncivil War by Greg Sargent of The Washington Post.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And happy Monday. It's a brand new week, a whole lot in the news today. Is it time to nationalize the fossil fuel industry? Before you get, all knee-jerk on me, let me lay out the case for it. We'll get there in just a moment. Also, what reaction would you expect among the American people and, of course, among the GOP if Donald Trump is indicted for any of the crimes that, it's fairly obvious he has committed? We'll get to that in our first hour. Also, at the bottom of the hour, Cole Stangler, who is a Paris-based journalist covering politics, labor, and culture, contributed to the New York Times and a writer for France 24, and a friend of the show. Cole's been on our show on and off for a decade, it seems, is going to drop by and fill us in on what's the deal here with Macron and Le Pen, and what are the takeaways from the French election. In the second hour, I want to get into this question of, did Jared Kushner just get $2 billion from Saudi Arabia for basically whitewashing the murder of Jamal Khashoggi? And why are people acting so weird? I mean, like road rage and bizarre eruptions of white nationalism and the bizarre nature of our politics. Is it because American life has become clickbait? We'll get into that in the second hour of the program. Some interesting analysis of this, in fact. And in our third hour, Greg Blustein is going to drop by for a deep dive, a 30-minute conversation, a Conversations with the Great Minds conversation, about his new book, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. That's not the title of his book. His book is called Flipped. That's the subtitle, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly. But, we'll get to all those things. But I want to start out with the rant today from HartmannReport.com. It's titled, "It's Time to Nationalize the Fossil Fuel Industry." Now, I know the moment you say nationalize, everybody thinks, oh my God, Venezuela, Iran. People don't think much about Norway, but and all the one time that a Democrat actually said this out loud was back in 2008. And it was during a hearing where the fossil fuel executives, the CEOs, were refusing to answer her questions. And Maxine Waters, Representative Maxine Waters, a black woman with power, something Republicans hate and fear more than anything else they can imagine. Maxine Waters basically came right out and said, if you don't start giving me straight answers, we're going to start talking about nationalizing your industry. She used the word socialize, but, same thing. And, of course, Fox News went nuts. They melted down. In fact, there's a link to it over in the op-ed at HartmannReport.com. But Fox News and all those on the right, and frankly, Democrats who freaked out when Maxine Waters said this, are either unaware of or completely ignoring the long history in this country of nationalizing industries that work against the national interest during a time of crisis. And if you don't think that this is a time of crisis, this climate crisis, well, I've got a tornado to sell you. Or the fact that, hey, it's April 11th and it snowed in Portland, Oregon. There's an inch of snow on the ground outside right now. Well, it's probably down to a half inch. It's starting to melt. But, it's never happened before. Last year, it was 116 degrees for 3 days in a row here. That's never happened before either. We're getting Phoenix weather alternating with North Pole weather. I mean, it's just... So, if you don't think that we're in a climate crisis, you're not paying attention. And in large part, this crisis has been brought about by the fact that the fossil fuel industry, for over 40 years, has been lying to us about the impact of their product on this crisis. And funding organizations that are out there lying about climate change and denying climate change, and funding politicians. I mean, look at Joe Biden had a plan, and the Democrats had a plan to spend $500 billion, $500 billion on greening the American economy. That really would have taken a good bite out of climate change. It would have reduced our carbon emissions substantially in this country over the next 5 or 10 years. And it was defeated, it passed the House. It was defeated by every Republican in the United States Senate, plus Joe Manchin, who's taking money from the fossil fuel industry. In fact, he's the single largest recipient of fossil fuel industry money in the United States Senate. This is an industry that is calling out for nationalization. I mean, 40 years ago, literally 40 years ago, Jimmy Carter, this was 1979, 43 years ago, actually, Jimmy Carter declared a national crisis. And he said, he was going to propose legislation to create, quote, this nation's first solar bank, which will help us achieve the crucial goal of 20% of our energy coming from solar power by the year 2000. You've heard me play the clip over and over and again. And he also, Jimmy Carter, the part that's not in the clip that I play for you so frequently, is he also wanted to create a program to sell bonds, essentially like war bonds. FDR did this during World War II. He created a nonprofit, a government agency, that sold government bonds. In other words, you could loan money to the federal government, essentially. Sold in today's dollars, billions of dollars worth of government bonds to fund an effort to invent synthetic rubber. This was during World War II, because we were running out of rubber for tires for fighter jets. And it worked, and FDR did that. And so Jimmy Carter said, just as a similar synthetic rubber corporation helped us win World War II, so will we mobilize American determination and ability to win the energy war. He proposed this in '79, and, it all came crashing down 42 years ago this coming January, when the fossil fuel industry's candidate, Ronald Reagan, replaced Carter in the White House, killed the solar bank and bond program, and even took Carter's solar panels off the roof of the White House. So if there was ever an industry that merited nationalization, right now it's the fossil fuel industry. But what's the history of this? During the crisis of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson nationalized the country's railroads, our phone companies, and our telegraph operators. He also nationalized the radio networks and all the radio stations in this country. They were returned to private ownership after the war, but he had nationalized them during the war. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing. He nationalized the airplane manufacturers. He nationalized several gun manufacturers. He nationalized over 3,300 mines in the United States. He nationalized the nation's railroads. He nationalized dozens of oil companies, Western Electric Company, the Hughes Tool Company, Goodyear Tire and Rubber, and even Montgomery Ward, along with 17 foreign companies doing business in the United States. After FDR died, Harry Truman came along, finished the war. He also nationalized the meatpacking industry across the country and the Monongahela Railroad Company, the nation's steel mills, and hundreds of rail companies. Nearly all were returned to the private sector after the war was over, although it did take until 1965 to re-privatize all of them. Then came Richard Nixon. In the wake of the collapse of the Penn Central Railroad, Richard Nixon oversaw the nationalization and transfer of 20 railroads into a new government entity that was called the National Rail Passenger Corporation. Today we call it Amtrak. Richard Nixon did that. In '74, Congress created another nationalized entity to deal with freight rail. I believe this was under Jerry Ford. It was called the Consolidated Rail Corporation. We called it Conrail. And it absorbed dozens of failing rail companies. This was nationalization. And they were government held until 1987 when it was privatized. That privatizing Conrail was the third largest IPO, actually at the time it was the largest IPO in American history. In 1984, the Continental Illinois Bank and Trust Company was in a crisis, and Ronald Reagan nationalized it. He bought an 80% ownership share in the company. It wasn't privatized until 1991 by George Herbert Walker Bush and was bought by Bank of America in '94. Also in the 80s, after Reagan recklessly deregulated the savings and loan industry, we saw S&Ls crash all across the country as the guys running them made off with billions of dollars in their own private money bins. And so Reagan and Congress created an umbrella agency. It was called the Resolution Trust Corporation, and they nationalized 747 of America's savings and loans. Assets over $400 billion. They were held as nationalized companies from 1987 until 1995, when they were re-privatized. Then that was Reagan, then George W. Bush. When he was handed the White House by 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court, the nation's airline security was entirely in private hands. After 9/11, Bush said, okay, that's it. And he nationalized airline security across the United States. He put the entire industry out of business. He didn't even bother buying these companies up and nationalizing them. He just shut them down and replaced them with what we call the TSA today, the Transportation Security Administration. He also nationalized the nation's airlines because they were in a crisis after 9/11. He created this thing called the Air Transportation Stabilization Board that ended up holding 7.5 million shares of U.S. Airways, 18 million shares of America West Airlines, 3.5 million shares of Frontier Airlines, 1.5 million shares of Transair, 2.38 million shares of World Airways. The Bush administration nationalized, the George W. Bush administration, again, nationalized the 2 largest mortgage lenders in the United States. When the crash happened in 2008, we nationalized Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. They nationalized 77% share in AIG, 36% share in Citigroup, 73% share in GMAC, and forced out GM's president, Rick Wagner, who was just doing a terrible job. Obama came into office and he nationalized GM and Chrysler. So, there's a long history of this. We could buy the 3 largest oil companies in the United States for less than $500 billion, about $500 billion. That's 1/4 or maybe 1/5 of the cost of the Bush tax or of the Trump tax cuts for billionaires. For 1/5 of what we paid to give tax cuts to billionaires, we could take over these three large oil companies and then just run them well, but stop all their funding of climate denial and start their seriously attending to the process of figuring out how to shift themselves from being oil companies to being energy companies. I mean, this is not rocket science. I realize people are freaking out about the politics of it. Oh my God, they're going to call the Democrats socialists. Every president since Eisenhower, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, has done this during times of crisis. And this is a crisis.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So what reaction do you expect if Donald Trump is indicted? We'll pick up that topic on the other side of the break. Stick around. And welcome back. Eric in Seattle. Hey, Eric, thanks for listening to KBCS. What's up?
Good morning, Tom. How are you?
I'm well.
So, good. So it's pretty ironic that your rant this morning about nationalizing our fossil fuel industry was right on time, because over the weekend I was reading an article at Jacobin West's website, and it's titled American think tanks are fueling the Mexican right, and it discusses AMLO's the president Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, his efforts to in mid-April there's going to be like a showdown in their Congress to pass this legislation to also what do you call it? What was the word that you mentioned about the government? Oh,
nationalize.
Nationalizing, yes, nationalizing not only their fossil fuel industry, but also their lithium stores and other natural resources that they have.
Right.
There are pushes from Jim Carrey has made visits out there.
This is what Chile did that provoked the CIA to support the overthrow of what's his name, and replace him with Pinochet.
Yeah, AMLO just got through a referendum for him to be in power for the next 6 years, or for a total of 6 years. Mm-hmm. The people overwhelmingly approved that. I think it was just the last few days. But he's trying to get this reform passed, and there's money going in there. The Baker Institute is involved. Ken Salazar is the head of a commission to try to dissuade.
So they're flipped out, not just that their interests. I'm assuming that they probably share some ownership interests with Pemex and things like that, but also mm-hmm. they're afraid that if it happens in Mexico and it's successful, it'll increase the pressure and drumbeat for the same thing to happen here in the United States.
And that's why I said it's perfect timing that you've spoken about this before, you've mentioned it, but you ranted about it today, and I think it's a great time. I think we need to do this, but in terms of climate change too. We need to control these companies and prevent them from causing any more damage.
They're actively poisoning our atmosphere, which we all live in. I mean, they're actively poisoning it, and then they are buying off politicians to pretend it's not happening. You can't find a Republican who will even acknowledge climate change, because they're all on the take from the fossil fuel industry.
Mm. And the fear-mongering that's being spread in Mexico is more on the lines of going backwards instead of moving forward. That, this privatization is not the way to move forward.
Or you're going to become like Venezuela.
Yeah. So, good timing, Tom. Thanks for your rant.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric.
And I was wondering if you can read that article and perhaps share a little bit more light of how the U.S. is,
Where did you find the article about Mexico?
Jacobin. It's on the Jacobin
over
website.
in Jacobin. Okay, great. I'll check it out.
Yes. It's 4/9/2022. That's when it was posted. American think tanks are fueling the Mexican right.
I'll do it. Eric, thank you very much for the call. Appreciate it. It's 22 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back. Donald Trump going down. What does that, what happens? What happens in American politics if Donald Trump is indicted? We'll be right back. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. Have you noticed that people are basically imitating Donald Trump all over the country? We're seeing all this rude behavior, sexist, racist behavior. People getting arrested at airport gates, airplanes being turned around because people are fighting with flight attendants, disorderly, rude, unhinged conduct. I mean, it's just gone nuts. Car crashes are up, gun deaths are up, shootings are up. Healthcare workers are being literally physically assaulted in some hospitals. They're having to put together panic buttons. This kind of behavior in our schools is increasing. It looks like, according to some sociologists, psychologists, and even business consultants, it looks like a lot of this ties back not just to the Trump presidency, with Donald Trump providing us with an example of how to be, an obnoxious person, but also the crisis of the pandemic. We've got a deeper dive into this topic over at thomhartmann.com. There's a great video about it. You can check it out there. Welcome back. So what reaction would you expect if Donald Trump is indicted? I mean, the January 6th panel now has enough evidence to prove that Donald Trump engaged in actual crimes, specifically trying to overthrow the government of the United States, trying to submit fraudulent electors. I mean, all this stuff is like, it's fairly obvious. There's an interesting piece in in the New York Times by Michael Schmidt and Luke Broadwater. The leaders of the House committee investigating the Capitol attack have grown divided over whether to make a criminal referral, they say. And then this is where it gets, really interesting. This is a statement not of what the politicians are saying. This is an assertion by these two reporters for the New York Times. Quote, "The Justice Department appears to be ramping up a wide-ranging investigation, and making a referral could saddle a criminal case with further partisan baggage at a time when Mr. Trump is openly flirting with running again in 2024. Really? I mean, what makes you think that if the Democrats... Well, first of all, what makes you think that the Republicans aren't going to politicize an indictment by Merrick Garland? I mean, essentially what they're saying is, okay, it looks like Merrick Garland is going to indict Trump. So the House committee should not make a criminal referral because that's just going to make the Republicans hysterical. The Republicans are going to be hysterical anyway. I mean, it seems to me that if actually the opposite of what this New York Times article is suggesting is the case. If Democrats don't make a criminal referral, and I realize that there's two Republicans on the committee, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, but if Democrats don't make, or if this committee doesn't make a criminal referral to the Justice Department, then what are the Republicans are going to say? They're going to say, hey, the Justice Department is acting on their own. Congress doesn't even agree with them. Even the Democrats don't agree with them. Come on, guys. Quit behaving like, you're afraid of the rain. I mean, it's like, come on, take the next step. Look at the polling. 69% of Americans agree that January 6th was wrong and the insurrection was a crime. Just do it. Make the criminal referral. Or do you think that if the January 6th committee makes a criminal referral, that it's going to cause, some political explosion that's going to blow up in Democrats' face? I'm not buying that story. Are you? What say you? Give us a shout, 202-808-9925. We'll be right back. It's 27 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And it's time to nationalize the oil industry. Stick around.
camera, right? 3. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Minority Leader, How to Lead from the Outside and Make Real Change by Stacey Abrams. This is from chapter 1, although the introduction is fascinating too, where she talks about, Rhodes scholarships and stuff, but this is chapter 1. I sit in a living room, a cozy space, warm in the early summer. I'm perched on the edge of a sofa next to Valerie, the home's owner, a lovely black woman in her late 40s. Across from us, seated close together on a wide settee meant for one, are her 2 children, a son and a daughter. Politicians rarely visit their streets, which are nestled in a poorer community in South Georgia. Valerie beams with pride that both her children are headed to college in the fall. David, 17, plans to study criminology. Maya, 18, her belly round with her first child, intends to become a middle school teacher. Both newly graduated from high school, Maya will give birth in mere weeks and begin college months later, an unwed teen mother. Her intended school is more than 3 hours north of her home, so her mother will raise her newborn baby while she starts her freshman year. Valerie speaks matter-of-factly about the coming challenge, raising a new child just as hers leaves the nest. Still, she is determined that both her children pursue college degrees that she never received. Maya, the mother-to-be, wonders how she'll do so far away from home and her baby. Yet in the next breath, she explains how college will be the best for her and her child. Their future success rests upon her. I've come to their home as part of my campaign for governor, so I asked Valerie what she expects of someone like me. What can I do to help make lives like hers better? In her soft voice, she replies, she just wants options for financial aid for her children. They will succeed, she says, if they can afford to stay in school. As I look around the modest home passed down through the generations, I understand both the pride and the desperation tangled in her response. She got them through and has given them the tools to carve out better lives for themselves. We chat more about the worries she's lived with all those years, our discussion turning to the crime and poverty in their neighborhood. Then I ask Valerie what she wants. At first, all I get in response is a quizzical look to suggest I need to reconsider my bid for higher office. Or that suggests. I repeat, what do you want for you? What secret dream do you have for yourself? Her confused expression turns to one of surprise. I don't know, she tells me. I've been a cashier at the Piggly Wiggly for 20 years. You must want something, I probe, something you'd like to do for you. A daycare, she admits quietly. I'd like to start a daycare center for unwed mothers like my daughter, so more girls can finish school and pursue their dreams. But that ambition is beyond her. Her body language, her tone of voice, her averted gaze speak louder than her words. I press her, but she demurs with a smile. Let's just see what happens if you win the governor's job, she says. Valerie's house in South Georgia is not too different from the squat red brick house where I grew up on South Street in Gulfport, Mississippi. An oak tree grew out in our front yard, shadowing the front sidewalk, forbidding grass to grow beneath its shade. Pink azaleas bloomed each spring from bushes that flanked the front door. Our rented house and the other set close by teemed with children, all black, all working class. We played in our postage-stamped yards, make believing the fantastical. Superhero exploits, cops and robbers. As we got older, we'd talk about moving to New Orleans or living in one of the mansions along the beachfront that lay less than 5 miles away, across the railroad tracks that ran in between our neighborhood and the more wealthy environs. We dreamed of more, while our parents' lives centered around survival and making it from paycheck to paycheck. Instinctively, we understood that more had to be possible, even if we didn't know what to do to get there. These imaginings, these desires, are the roots of ambition. As adults, like Valerie, we tend to edit our desires until they fit our construction of who we're supposed to become. In such a world, I wouldn't dare dream of running for higher office, for mayor or governor or president. At least for now, Valerie sees herself retiring in 20 more years from Piggly Wiggly as a cashier, rather than as a small business owner who helps the community raise its children. From our brief meeting, I could see she had the fire, albeit of a low burn, of a minority leader. She had ambition, she had vision, but she didn't have the faith, and understandably so. Whether we come from working class neighborhoods or grow up comfortably middle class, minorities rarely come of age explicitly thinking about what we want and how to get it. People already in power almost never have to think about whether they belong in the room, much less if they would be listened to once outside. These men, and they are usually men and typically white, do not have to grapple with low expectations based on gender or race or class. Ambition for them begins with reminiscences of old times and older friendships or newer alliances. The ends have already been decided. Only the means are to be discussed. Most potential minority leaders feel the same lack of faith Valerie had, at least at some point in their evolution. We may not know how to get the first job, let alone make it to the big chair. We don't know how to take the leap from accepting our fates to actually changing them, and not just a little, but radically. Then there are those who simply don't know what they want. The drive to achieve burns inside, often without a clear target. We want to be something, but what that is remains hazy. Often we cannot articulate our goals because they lie just beyond the reach of who we're supposed to be. Ambition's scale is irrelevant. What holds us back is not scope, it's fear. And because we don't know what to call our dreams, don't know how to make them happen, or are pretty sure we'll be disappointed, we just stand still. We become a minority, but becoming a minority leader demands that we embrace ambition as our due. Stacey Abrams.
Much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. Welcome back. 34 minutes past the hour. We'll be picking up your calls in just a few moments, or a few minutes. But first, Cole Stangler is an old friend of the show, writer and producer at France 24, now lives in Paris. Paris-based journalist covering labor, culture, and politics. He also is a contributor to the New York Times. ColeStangler.com is his website. Cole Stangler, Stangler, is also his Twitter handle. Cole, welcome back to the program. It's been a while since we've talked. I'm really grateful you could, drop in on the show today. I wanted to talk with you. Well, thank you. I wanted to talk with you about the French elections. Macron and Le Pen are going into the finals here, and it seems to me that the big issue that is hurting Macron, correct me if I'm wrong on this, is his embrace of neoliberal policies. But give us your take on what's happening right now first.
Yeah, I mean, Macron has suffered tremendously, in terms of his popularity over the course of his presidency. And, I think it's important to remember, even when he was first elected in 2017, he had a real base of support. But when he was elected in opposition to Marine Le Pen, he benefited from an immense amount of support from people who wanted to simply prevent Marine Le Pen, the far right, from essentially taking over the country. And the problem is that over the course of these last 5 years, since Macron was elected in 2017, I think the fundamental problem is that he's governed the country as if he had a massive mandate for these extremely pro-business reforms that have contributed to increased inequality in France, that have contributed to freezing in spending on public services, that have contributed to frustrations among working class people and lower income people that we saw with the Yellow Vest movement. And that's really the fundamental problem here. And we saw, I think, the same problem exposed with the results yesterday, in which Macron, despite governing with this massive mandate, ultimately did not really have that strong of a score, around 28% in the first round. And now going into the runoff round against Le Pen, if you look at the polls, they're pretty close. And I think it comes back to this idea of Macron governing as if they had this huge mandate. And pretty clearly, I don't think it isn't the case. We're seeing it picked up in the polls right now.
Yeah, I mean, he put through a massive tax cut for rich people. He's been weakening labor protections. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. And there's a movement in France from the far left, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, if I'm remembering correctly, is
Mélenchon, yeah.
Yeah, he got 21% of the vote. I mean, he was like within spitting distance of Le Pen. And he's out there saying it's time for us to bring our jobs back home. I mean, let's even back off a little bit on this globalization stuff and bring back some of the French manufacturing to replace some of the Chinese goods. Or am I, you live there. I don't. Am I misreading that?
No, I mean, yeah, Mélenchon got a lot of support. A really, in a lot of ways they're different, but in some ways they're the same. They're similar, at least in terms of the coalition. A very Bernie Sanders-like coalition composed of some amount of working class people who lean to the left, which is significant in a time in which the left has lost so much of its historic links to unions and the working class. So that chunk of support, Mélenchon led among young voters, so age 18 to 24, voted in significant numbers for Mélenchon. Macron was below in third when it comes to younger voters, behind Mélenchon and Le Pen. And Mélenchon also picked up on this sort of more middle-class vote, middle-class professionals who lean to the left. So a very Sanders-like coalition that I think was very impressive if you look at the score, even more so when you consider the context that we're in today in France, in which you have the mainstream political forces that are very hostile to Mélenchon's program, which is not ultimately that radical of a program. It really is a fundamentally social democratic platform, raising the minimum wage, investing in public services, spending money to fight climate change. But Mélenchon's faced a lot of hostility from the political establishment. He's also faced hostility from the media establishment. And I've written about it before, and others have been talking a lot about this more recently. But the media in France, in some ways, similar to what we've seen in the US, is pushing the country in this really rightward direction. You turn on the news in France and you're more likely than not going to hear things about immigration, Islam, French identity. And that's the sort of kind of backdrop. There's a lot of factors that go into it, but that's sort of the backdrop for Marine Le Pen's success. And again, to get back to my initial point, it makes it all the more remarkable that Mélenchon was able to get the score that he did, sort of in the context that we are in today in France.
Do you think that if Macron wins this election, this runoff election in 2 weeks, that he will continue to govern in this kind of almost a synthesis between Bill Clinton and Donald Trump? Embracing neoliberalism and flirting with the hard right, in ways, or will he shift in the direction of Mélenchon toward the left?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of voters on the left. I mean, first off, I should be clear. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate it too much, but I'm not so sure even that Macron's going to be able to win this election. I mean, he is the favorite right now. He probably will win, but I don't think we should take that for granted.
Well, if Le Pen wins, then what does that mean for France and for the European Union and for the future of, basically democracy in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be pretty catastrophic if Le Pen won the election. If you look at her program, now as we're having to take this prospect more and more seriously, people are looking more carefully at this program, and legal experts have pointed out that you have a number of elements in here that are flat out unconstitutional or would be considered unconstitutional. Having a referendum on immigration, giving additional rights to French nationals, reducing rights for people that have dual nationality. She wants to get rid of the giving French nationality to people if they're born on French soil, that they can obtain it after a period of time if they're born to foreign parents, etc. All these proposals that aren't just heinous on a sort of moral, ethical, social level, but also pose a lot of legal problems. And people, if you look at this program, the parallel would be maybe something like Hungary or Poland, where you're kind of operating in this sort of legal gray area where you are more or less openly flouting European laws, perhaps flouting domestic laws that have been in place. And so it's extremely concerning. And then not to mention, of course, perhaps, to draw parallels to the US, again, what we saw after Donald Trump's election, the way that it legitimized further, really vile strains of thought against Muslims, against minorities, Black people of color. And that's something that a lot of people are worried about in France. But the question is there going to be enough support behind Macron this time to get him over the hump? It's a lot closer. He's in the lead if you look at the polls right now, but I really don't think we should take it for granted that he's going to be elected. And this goes back also to their mentality in office, is that a lot of people are very critical of Macron and have a sense of resentment against him precisely because they see him operating in this sort of bubble where he's not taking into account the fact that people are upset. And that he needs to sort of give them a reason to vote for them. That's what a lot of people on the left I've been speaking to just today who are hesitating about whether or not to vote. It'd be nice to have something in their direction, given the fact that if you look at these you look at these results, Mélenchon got, over 20% of the vote. So if Macron, I think, was thinking in his best interest, perhaps there would be, some sort of bone given to these left-wing voters. But based on the way that he's governed so far, I don't think we should hold our breath necessarily for that. Right.
This label of president for the rich has stuck, and he seems to, the label of arrogance is also stuck. Do I have that right? Yeah,
and it's and it's reflected. And I was just looking over all the. It's not quite exit polls in French because it's not conducted exactly after people leaving the polls, but it's the equivalent of exit polls. Looking at the numbers yesterday, Macron's voters skew wealthy. They're wealthier than the average French population. They're much older than the rest of the French population. So certainly there's a sort of political label of calling him president of the rich. But if you look at his base of support, Macron has support from people making more money than the rest of the French population, and Le Pen vice versa. So, we'll see what happens in a couple of weeks.
It's going to be a fascinating ride here. Cole Stangler, France 24, and ColeStangler.com, and Cole Stangler on Twitter. Cole, thanks a lot for dropping by. It's always great seeing you. Great having you with us. We'll be right back. It's 44 minutes past the hour. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Time to nationalize the fossil fuel industry. What reaction do you expect if Donald Trump is indicted? How do you think the French elections are going to affect the rest of the free world? And welcome back. Saber in West Covina, California. Hey, Saber, what's on your mind today?
Good morning, Tom. How are you doing?
I am well. What's up?
I think if Trump faced justice, if he went down, I think it would be a huge milestone in this country, because we have seen that it would show that there's accountability for our most powerful and corrupt politicians, which has never been the case. I mean, I'm still waiting for Cheney and Bush to go down on war crimes.
Yeah, I don't think that's ever going to happen, but this is arguably even more egregious. I mean, it's lying the country into a war is a pretty terrible thing, but it's happened 4 or 5 times in our history. This trying to overthrow the government, but using violence to overthrow the government. And 5 people died that day, and I think 7 people altogether died as a consequence of that. That's a whole nother level of horror. Okay. Saber, thank you very much. Thanks for your thoughts. Ken in Nashville, Tennessee. Hey, Ken, what's up?
Good morning. This is about something you were talking about earlier. Maybe I've got this wrong, but that's not the way I remembered as you stated it. GM and Chrysler were never nationalized. What it was is that GM was given a loan, and they paid it back. And Chrysler, I don't know if they got a loan or not. I think they may have.
Yeah, no, that's not the way it worked, Ken. We actually, the federal government created a new corporation. It was called the New GMCO, LLC, the New GM. They referred to it as the New GM. It was owned by the government. The General Motors itself went bankrupt. The assets of General Motors were transferred into this New GM Corporation, which was owned by our government. We made the loan to the New GM Corporation, and the New GM on the condition that that Wagoner, the CEO of GM, quit, and he quit. He stepped down. And for several years, or at least a year, the government owned that New GM Co., and then they reprivatized it. They sold it back into the marketplace. The company right now that is GM is not the same company it was before. It's literally a different corporation.
Gotcha. But however, wasn't Chrysler basically bought out by Fiat?
Ultimately, yeah, but the transition money, it wasn't a full government privatization with Chrysler. It was less than 50%. I think it was 34%. It's in my article. I'd have to go back and look. But with GM, it was 100%.
Oh, gotcha. I never realized it. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and you'll find the links to the sources over at HartmannReport.com if you want the details. Thanks a lot for the call. Morris in Long Beach. Hey, Morris, hold on. Let me put you on hold here. I've just got 41 seconds. That's not fair to you or anybody else. Just to wrap up the conversation with Macron. Macron has carried 28% of the vote. Le Pen has 23% of the vote. And Mélenchon, the Bernie Sanders of France, he has 22% of the vote. And, now because Le Pen got that 1 extra percent over Mélenchon, she's the one that is going to go into the runoffs with Macron. Frankly, if instead the Bernie of France, Mélenchon, had gotten 1 additional percentage point and taken it from Le Pen, so he got 23 instead of Le Pen, then Macron would be going up against a guy to his left, and he would have to start shifting to the left. Right now, he's going up against a woman to his right. And sadly, it seems that, he may be shifting to his right. Although Cole is saying he thinks he needs to bring in the Mélenchon voters, it's going to get real interesting. Stick around. We'll be right back with your calls. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. The American Lung Association just came out with an amazing new study where they took Joe Biden's goal of a zero-emission power grid by 2035 and zero-emission passenger vehicles across the United States by 2035, which is a ways down the road, and trucks and buses being zero emission by 2040, and said, okay, what'll happen if we do this? They discovered that over 100,000 lives would be saved, people who wouldn't be getting cancer and COPD and asthma and all these kind of things. Over $1.2 trillion in public health costs would be avoided, and just massive, and 2.8 million fewer asthma attacks, among other public health problems. They note how extraordinary this would be, what a huge and positive impact it would have on America's public health, and how it's completely doable. The American Lung Association. The one note they say is that, quote, opposition from Republicans and 2 key Democratic senators makes it easier said than done. You can check it out at thomhartmann.com. And welcome back. Morris in Long Beach, California. Hey, Morris, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, you're talking about indicting former President Trump, right?
Yes, sir.
You can't do that. I'm going to tell you why you can't do that. If you indict Donald Trump, you're taking down the entire Republican Party. You know darn well they're guilty of, they got insurrectionist blood on their hands right now, Howley Cruz, a whole lot of them. And you know the kind of brother that Donald Trump is, he's not going to go down by himself. I think the best way out would be for the former president to come up, with some kind of illness. He got to step back out to public. He's sick right now. But if we follow through with indicting that fool, Thom Hartmann, all hell is going to break loose, because that guy's not going to go down by himself. You saw 4 years of his administration and his way out. I could defend Trump. Believe it or not, I'm Morris Phillips from Long Beach. I could defend Trump. What Trump will say is this: I got bad advice. I got bad advice. I was following the lead of this guy and that guy. And then those people who were responsible for supporting the 25th Amendment that didn't do it, he'll just burn them. So what do you think?
I think that you're going to hear, I agree with you, Morris, that all hell will break loose. You're going to hear all kinds of hysterics coming out of Trump. At the same time, right now, the GOP is starting to move away from Trump. I don't know if you caught the story about the gridiron dinner. The big story around the gridiron dinner is that all these 73 people so far have tested positive for COVID, including like Nancy Pelosi and, et cetera. But I thought the most important story out of that was that Chris Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, got up and called Trump an effing child and said basically that everybody, Republicans all across the country are laughing at him behind his back. This was, and he used the F word repeatedly when referring to Trump. And this is like a Republican governor who would, like to be a senator one day and maybe even president. And, the heir to the Sununu political dynasty in the Northeast. So I think that an indictment of Trump might be the last straw for a lot of Republicans who are, kind of holding on to Trump because he has the base, but it may cause them to say, okay, that's it. We're going to cut that cord.
You ever heard of the scenario knowing where the dead bodies are buried? You ever heard somebody, he knows where the dead bodies are buried? Yeah. This guy knows where the dead bodies are buried. I'm telling you right now, Tom, you're smarter than me. They cannot indict this guy because if they do, everybody's going down. You got all of your Republican parties going down. You got congressmen going down.
So you think Trump would be basically telling the rest of the Republicans, I'm going to take you guys down with me?
You better believe it, and he darn sure would. If I started a gang, he wouldn't be in my gang, because I know as soon as the police busted us and got some heat on him, he'd sell us all out.
Yeah.
That's exactly what he's going to do. I'll talk to you later.
I get it. Thank you, Morris. David in Dallas, Texas. Hey, David, what's up? David, you are on the air, listening on Sirius XM. Okay, I'm going to... Oh, there we go. David, hang on just a second. Let me get you back on there. I pushed the wrong button. Okay, David, you are on the air. What's on your mind?
Okay. I love your idea of nationalizing the energy sector of our economy. I have never understood why they get to drill oil and natural gas out of the ground and make money from it. That belongs to all of us. That oil.
I'm with you. Plus, they get a $600 billion a year subsidy.
Yes, I mean, who made them king? Why are they drilling our oil out of the ground and selling it back to us?
Well, who made them king was arguably John D. Rockefeller back in the day.
Yeah,
I mean, basically, they owned American politics since the 1880s.
Right, the first Gilded Age.
Yep.
But I would add two other sectors. I would add banking and healthcare, because these are the underpinnings of our society. They should not be in private hands. They should be in the hands of a functional government.
Yeah.
And if we started with energy, banking, and healthcare, we might have a livable country and, one in which people can survive.
I'm with you. David, thank you. You said it very, very well. Joe, in Bothell, Washington. Hey, Joe, what's up?
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking the call. Nationalizing the energy industry, yes, I'm all for that. Sounds like a good plan. In terms of Trump being indicted, it's a must. We are a country of laws. And if it's been shown that Trump has broken the law and he isn't held accountable, that will give people like him and others in the Republican Party to just basically flout the law.
Yeah. So you're saying if the January 6th committee, I mean, odds are that the Justice Department, well, I shouldn't say odds are they're going to indict him. God only knows. But they certainly have the evidence already to indict him. I mean, Merrick Garland can do this. So the big question is, should the January 6th committee make a criminal referral? It really is just performance art. I mean, whether they do it or not, it has no legal basis other than just, another branch of government saying to the executive branch, hey, here's our opinion on this. But go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I think everything that the Democrats are doing, even though this is a bipartisan commission, the Democrats in general are just too tentative in their approach on everything.
Yeah.
They must be more assertive. The Republicans' messaging is assertive, so Democrats must be assertive. As a matter of fact, I hope to talk with you and Senator Pocan on Friday about messaging, because I have some definite ideas about that and would like to hear his input. But getting back to Trump, no one is above the law. The Republicans are going to be up in arms. They're just going to cry outrage, because that's what they do. They have no plan, so they just cry outrage. If we don't do this, if we don't prosecute those who've broken the law, then we have failed, and we're in for big troubles in the future.
Yeah, the question, this is being dealt with though as a political question, and the Democrats are concerned that. Frankly, I think that they would be perfectly happy to turn this information over to the Justice Department after the November elections. But before the November elections, they're afraid that if they do that, that's going to activate Trump's base, who will come out and vote for any old Republican on the ballot just because they're pissed off. I don't know if that's true. I think it may actually cause a schism in the GOP.
I think you're right, and you made a really good point about pointing out this meeting earlier where Trump does seem to be losing some support.
Yeah, the gridiron dinner.
Thank you for the call.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Joe. Appreciate the call. We'll continue. Did Jared Kushner get $2 billion for selling out Jamal Khashoggi? And why are people acting so weird? Is it because of life in America? Basically, all of our news has become clickbait? We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The hidden history of Big Brother in America, how the death of privacy and the rise of surveillance threaten us and our democracy, by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at cozyearth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at hartmanreport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at dinovite.com.
Today we're reading about Thunderdome politics, an uncivil war taking back our democracy in an age of Trumpian disinformation and Thunderdome politics by Greg Sargent, the Washington Post columnist. This is from his chapter on voter suppression. It's page 37. Republicans and Democrats inhabit different political realities, as mentioned in a previous chapter. But there are certain facts about our politics that are just objectively true. One of them is this. Generally speaking, efforts to make it harder to vote are almost always pushed by Republicans. You cannot understand what is happening in American politics right now without recognizing this stark and very fundamental difference between the two major political parties. During this decade, procedural hurdles were put into place in around 20 states that in some manner or other have made it harder to vote or to register to vote, or have undone previous efforts to make voting or registering easier, or have otherwise threatened serious disenfranchisement. Most of them were the creation of Republican lawmakers and officials. The difference in the two parties' national platforms for 2016 tells the story. The GOP platform champions additional hurdles that are absurdly disproportionate to the phantom abuse it alleges, while the Democratic platform champions multiple specific ways to make it easier to vote, not harder. The most common and controversial of methods used by Republicans to suppress Democratic turnout is the requirement that would-be voters present identification at the polls. The game here tends to turn on requiring forms of ID that some groups are less likely to have, making participation harder for them. Other restrictions include techniques like cutting back on early voting and making it harder to register, both of which have, in recent years, been instituted in multiple states. Republicans who have passed laws making it harder to vote have tended to claim such measures are necessary to protect against, quote, voter fraud. We'll look at this in more detail below, but for now, note that most of the states that have passed such measures did so while under Republican control. As New York University political scientist Samuel Isikoff has memorably put it, the single predictor necessary to determine whether a state will impose voter access restrictions is whether Republicans control the ballot access process. Scholars trace the modern era of warfare over election rules to the intensely contested presidential election of 2000, in which a divided Supreme Court halted the recount in Florida, throwing the presidency to George W. Bush. The closeness and partisan acrimony of that contest, combined with the intense national focus on election rules that accompanied the court battle over it, helped persuade both parties to invest much more attention and energy on those rules. As a result, both the implementation of measures restricting the ballot and the legal battles over them have intensified in recent years. A brief glance at the surprising history of voter ID laws begins to tell the story of this tightening. In the 1970s, several states implemented voter ID measures, but all of them provided for ways that voters without the proper ID could cast a ballot. By 2000, there were 14 such laws, and they had been implemented by politicians in both parties. But by the mid-2000s, amid rising post-2000 acrimony, a handful of red states began implementing voter ID laws that the nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures described as, quote, strict, meaning that they make it easy to disqualify those who don't pass muster. After one of those laws in Indiana was challenged and then upheld in 2008 by the Supreme Court, an escalation began that gained momentum in the Obama era. From 2010 onward, the adoption of voter ID laws in general and of strict ones in particular accelerated. Though a handful were blocked in the courts, as of this writing, a total of 34 states have voter ID laws in effect, 24 that are deemed non-strict and 10 that are deemed strict. The strict ones are in red states or in swing states where they were implemented by Republicans. The story is very similar if you evaluate the state's voting rules in a broader way, by including not just voter ID measures, but also cutbacks to early voting and restrictions on registration. Here the trend is just as pronounced. After the 2010 elections, the Brennan Center for Justice documented a sharp rise in efforts to pass such measures in the state legislatures across the country. Not all these efforts bore fruit, but many did. By the time voting took place in Election Day 2016, some 14 states had these new restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election. Now, as of this writing, by the Brennan Center's count, some 20 states have successfully implemented either strict voting ID requirements or cutbacks to early voting or restrictions on registration or other measures with meaningful disenfranchising effects. If you're a liberal who's frustrated by the seemingly unbreakable Republican dominance of national politics, not to mention GOP control of most state governments across the country, then the chances are that these restrictions figure heavily into your explanation of this GOP supremacy. Indeed, social media has been absolutely saturated in recent years with variations of the lament that Republican political dominance is largely maintained through a combination of nefarious and undemocratic tactics, such as ballot restrictions that keep constituencies unfriendly to the GOP from voting, and extreme gerrymanders that have, in effect, built a fortress around the GOP's majority in the House of Representatives. Democrats frequently invoke the GOP's use of these tactics, often justifiably, to raise money and to galvanize turnout. This narrative contains some important truths. Some of the forms that these restrictions on voting access have taken in recent years are diabolically obvious in their efforts to keep constituencies supportive of Democrats from voting. Still others boast the distinction of being more insidiously designed and thus less obvious in their intentions. The book is An Uncivil War by Greg Sargent of the Washington Post. Chapter 1.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. The headline over at the New York Times by David Kilpatrick and Kate Kelly is, before giving billions, that's plural with an S, to Jared Kushner, Saudi investment fund had big doubts. So Jared Kushner just went over to Saudi Arabia and got $2 billion, $2,000 million from the Saudi government. Now, I would argue to you that this is explicit, direct payback for two things. One, as Saudi Arabia was bombing the crap out of Yemen, creating an international crisis, millions of starving refugees, a humanitarian crisis, the Trump administration was negotiating a deal, or put together a deal, to sell them even more weaponry to bomb the crap out of the Yemenis. And number two, as the federal government was starting to look into the killing of Jamal Khashoggi by the, apparently by agents of the Crown Prince, who's basically running Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, the Trump administration basically said, we don't care about that. We're going to turn away from that. We're going to ignore that. The Obama administration had been looking into it. We're going to put all that on hold. We're going to kill all that. And in fact, we're going to make our first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia. Now, who came up with that great idea? I'll bet it was Jared Kushner. Donald Trump doesn't have, ideas like this. This guy, I mean, keep in mind, his daddy went to prison for being a grifter. Jared Kushner is a first-class grifter. When his daddy got out of prison, Jared was single and the heir to a grifter empire, as it were. And daddy, according to some reports, told him, you need to do three things, son. You need to buy a newspaper in New York, and Jared bought the New York Observer. You need to buy a high-profile building in Manhattan. So Jared overpaid to buy 666 Fifth Avenue, which is a big office building. And you need to marry a woman who has a lot of money and high credibility. And so he married Ivanka Trump. And it's been uphill, going to the sky ever since. So now he's created this company, Affinity Partners. He went over to Saudi Arabia, and they gave him $2 billion. Now, meanwhile, the media is getting ready to go all hysterical about Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden took $3 million from a Chinese company, or maybe it was a Russian company, or maybe it was a Ukrainian company. Who knows? But Hunter Biden took some money. Well, and it looks like Hunter Biden did. He exploited his father's political standing as vice president. That's, I think, fairly obvious. Not uncommon, by the way, but fairly obvious and pretty skeezy. But $3 million for Hunter versus $2 billion for Jared? And Hunter wasn't even selling out Jamal Khashoggi or selling out the citizens of Yemen. Whereas, Jared was doing all of that stuff, and many, many people are dead as a result of it. Steve Mnuchin, by the way, also started an investment fund. And he went to Saudi Arabia and said, hey, I helped you guys out too, hey, I'd like some money. And they gave him $1 billion. They charged him a 0.25%, 0.25% higher, or actually it's the other way around. Steve Mnuchin's fund is being paid a 1% management fee, on this $1 billion. And Jared Kushner is being paid a 1.25% management fee, if the information that I have here is correct. So Kushner gets better terms, he gets more money, he gets more profit than even Steve Mnuchin. And it looks to me like the Saudi government is just paying back their old buddies, which makes you wonder about this $100 million remortgaging of Donald Trump's Trump Tower in New York City. It came through this internet bank, and we don't know a whole lot about that and who their connections are or where their money is. And, I have no details on that right now. It looks like investigative reporters are digging into it. And pretty much any other financial interactions or things that Donald Trump is doing. Because basically the rational banks of the world have said, no, we're not going to support this guy anymore. So did Jared Kushner get the $2 billion for selling out Khashoggi? Or was it for providing Saudi Arabia with all these weapons to go after Yemen? Or was it about, keeping America's mouth closed, our lips sealed about the Saudi atrocities? Or was it about, this was also around the time when there was this women's movement in Saudi Arabia, where a number of high-profile women, including some of the royal family, were speaking out saying, hey, we would like some rights here. The MBS said, okay, you can drive now. But one of the women who was like the leader of the Women Should Be Allowed to Drive movement, we're not talking about voting here. We're not talking about owning a business or owning anything. We're not talking about having any independent rights. We're talking about driving. One of the women who had been the leaders of the driving movement ended up, in a brutal prison. Was it about that? I mean, exactly why did Jared Kushner get this $2 billion? Particularly, and this is the skeeziest part of the whole thing. This is from again, from today's New York Times. The Saudi Crown Prince controls this investment fund that has over $600 billion in it. Kushner comes and says, I want 2 of those $1 billion. The Crown Prince kicks it to the oversight board, as it were, to the fund. Right? It has a group of people whose job is to vet any investments. And they came back and they said, you shouldn't give him the money because of the inexperience of the affinity fund management. In other words, these people have never done this before. They don't know what they're doing. Secondly, you shouldn't do it, MBS, because of the possibility that the kingdom would be responsible for the bulk of the investment and the risk. We could lose all $2 billion of this. I mean, Kushner's dad was a grifter, right? He was like, a major grifter. He went to federal prison for being a grifter. You sure you want to give this guy $2 billion? They also said that the due diligence, in other words, looking at the bookkeeping and the finances, the management structure, all this stuff for Jared Kushner's new company was, quote, unsatisfactory in all aspects. All aspects. And they also said, by the way, the fee that he wants to charge us, quote, seems excessive. But just days after the board says, no, you shouldn't be doing this, Mohammed bin Salman, the functional king of Saudi Arabia, the crown prince, says, yeah, sure, we're going to give my buddy Jared all the money he wants. Is this going to in any way soften the Republican attacks on Hunter Biden? Do you think that there could be a little both sidesism here going on? Is that what I'm doing? Is it appropriate? Your thoughts after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Also, why are we behaving so weird? Why are Americans behaving so weird these days? I have some thoughts on that to share with you after the break. Okay, welcome back. Mike in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Hey, Mike, what's on your mind today?
Oh, I got a lot on my mind, but I'll keep it kind of narrowly targeted so that we don't take up too much time. Guy McPherson has been marginalized pretty effectively, and I think this guy should be hauled out of the closet again and brought up, and we need to have him talk, because you're right about nothing moving on this climate change thing. I think people just don't think it's real. And I know most of these climate scientists were very conservative with their estimates, like, the New Green Deal thing from 2030, 2050. We just don't have that time. And we really need leadership. The United States is locked up with their democracy. It can't move one way or the other. And we just don't have time to argue. We do need some strong leadership. And I read somebody posit that maybe China will be the country that kind of takes the helm and is able to direct things. I just don't see anything happening in the United States. But I think we need to be frightened a little bit, like Guy was. I think he was regarded as an extreme example of a climate scientist. But he's the one that pretty much pushed the effectiveness of the loops and how that affects the change exponentially.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until Greta Thunberg that she really emphasized the loops, and I think that's when it brought it to the media attention again. But I don't think people understand the math that's involved with the exponential changes.
Yeah, I get that, Mike. I'm not sure that saying that it's all over, we should just give up and let's just be nice to each other and live our lives quietly as the world burns down around us is the message that is going to cause, any kind of change. And I do think that there still is time for change that might, at the very least, save humanity, even though, I think that we're probably on a path climate-wise that is going to lead to the destruction of a lot of our governments and our countries around the world, and a massive disruption. But I get it, and I'm with you on let's have a more
crank it up.
Yeah, there you go. Yep, thank you, Jessica in Chicago. Hey, Jessica, thanks for watching Free Speech. Your thoughts?
Hi. Hi, Tom. When you spoke about Jared's $2 billion from Saudi, I remember calling you back when he ran the coronavirus task force.
Uh-huh.
And he had purchased $52 billion of Saudi Arabia test kits with our taxpayers' money.
Whoa.
And the thing is, 5 million COVID test kits were worthless. They never worked. And here's the crazy thing. I was looking it up online, and the scary part is when they bought these coronavirus test kits from Saudi, they labeled it in our government database. They labeled it as a technology that was purchased, and they spelled technology wrong. It's like they wanted it to just disappear, so there would be no remembering.
He had his merry little band of ex-MBA students that he knew from college. I mean, people in their 20s who were passing out millions of dollars willy-nilly, left and right, to companies, to companies that were being created by grifters all over the country. They're just starting now to dig into this stuff. It's amazing, Jessica. You're absolutely right. Thank you so much for the call. It's 18 minutes past the hour. We'll be back. Why are people acting so weird? I want to dig into that for a few minutes, and then I'll get back to your phone calls right after that. Stick around. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. Remember Paul Manafort? He used to be business partners with Roger Stone back in the day, working for Republican politicians like, Nixon and Reagan. Well, in 2004, he took a really sweet gig over in Ukraine, helping the Russians, President Putin, install Viktor Yanukovych as the president of Ukraine, a nice Putin puppet. That same year, though, the people of Ukraine said enough, and basically Yanukovych got driven out of the country. Welcome back. It's 19 minutes past the hour, and I wanted to get into this why are people acting so weird thing. First of all, Olga Kazan wrote a piece over at theatlantic.com about this a week or three ago. And, started out by saying, Will Smith smacking Chris Rock at the Oscars, a guy arrested punching a gate agent at the Atlanta airport, people throwing tantrums while skiing. Yes, this had to do with refusing to comply with a mask mandate. This guy, got all upset and on the ski lifts. And this is just strange stuff. Disorderly, rude, unhinged conduct. People accusing each other of all kinds of weird and strange things. Americans driving more recklessly. 2021 saw the highest number of unruly passenger incidents ever for the FAA. We're seeing car crashes and pedestrian deaths at higher rates than in the past. Healthcare workers are talking about their patients behaving more violently. In Missouri, some of the hospitals had to outfit nurses with panic buttons because of the uptick in disruptive behavior. In 2020, the U.S. murder rate rose by nearly a third, the biggest increase on record, and then rose again last year, 2021. Car thefts are up. School board meetings have melted down. So Olga Kazan asks over at theatlantic.com, what on earth is happening? And proposes a few of the thoughts on what's actually going on. Number one, we're feeling stressed and overwhelmed. For one thing, for 4 years, we had a neo-fascist grifter in the White House who threatened nuclear war with North Korea, a nuclear-armed country. It made a few people a little nervous, and justifiably so. Plus, a lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people lost, almost 1 million Americans lost a loved one, a family member. Well, actually, more than 1 million. We lost almost 1 million. It's going to hit 1 million in the next month or so. 1 million people. That's tens of millions of people who know somebody or loved somebody that they have lost. And then there's these provocations. You've got staff shortages, long waits for help, mask mandates. people in their mood. Also, rudeness can be contagious. I think this is an important point that Olga is pointing out over on this Atlantic piece. People, she asked this psychology professor at the University of Wisconsin, who noted people who witness rudeness are 3 times less likely to help someone else. People are picking up on rudeness from social media. In fact, it was interesting yesterday we were watching France 24 about the French elections. And they were just asking people on the street, what do you think about what's going on? And one of them said, social media, particularly Facebook and Twitter, have just been pounding Macron and elevating Marine Le Pen. And of course, it's bots. In fact, a lot of it appears to be Russian bots that are trying to promote a right-wing candidate in France. Because Marine Le Pen in the past has said, let's get out of NATO. So this is not just happening in the United States. Also, people in America during the pandemic were drinking more. They were doing more drugs. Americans have been drinking 14% more than before the pandemic. We're also buying a lot more guns. We bought something like 30 million more guns in 2020, which spiked the gun murder rate. And then we bought another, more guns in 2021, another spike in the gun murder rate. Kids stopped going to school. Their parents stopped going to work. So we weren't having contact with other people. We weren't having these social interactions. People stopped going to church. And all of this social isolation kind of brings out the worst in all of us. And then here comes Jerry Springer. He was on, my friend and colleague Dino Badala's show here on Sirius XM. He said that his talk show, he believes, and he's kind of owning this. He's feeling guilty about this, Jerry Springer, former mayor of Cleveland, I think it was. But, he did this talk show where he would bring on people who would throw chairs at each other and yell and scream and all this kind of stuff. And he told Dean, he said, the behavior of some of the people on the show is exactly Donald Trump. He said, however, the people on my show, they had enough sense not to run for president. He talks about what made Trump unique. He said, the only thing that separates Trump from the guests on my show, this is Jerry Springer talking to Dino Badala on Sirius XM. He said, the only thing that separates Trump from the guests on my show is the fact that he had this delusion that he knew how to run the world or run the country, when in fact he knows nothing about how to run a country. And we paid the price for that. It's interesting. In 2018, and he also gets into the tax cuts. He says, what an absurdity. What are you giving people like me a tax cut? If you're willing, because a wealthy person gets a couple more dollars in a paycheck, if you're willing to sell the soul of America for a couple more bucks, then don't ever ask a young man or woman to fight and die for this country, because you don't believe in it. Excuse me, you don't believe in this country. Springer was speaking to a labor union in Cincinnati, actually, when he made those remarks. So what do you think is causing all this? Pick up your calls and get to all that stuff. Andrew in Yardley, Pennsylvania. Hey, Andrew, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hello. Thanks for taking my call. I was angry because Alvin Bragg quashed the investigation into Donald Trump, and he returned the evidence.
Right. I agree with you.
And I have found out that there is a way to remedy this, that the governor of New York State, Kathy Hochul, has the power to replace Alvin Bragg with anyone she likes. And a new DA in Manhattan is eminently possible if everyone would call Governor Kathy Hochul of New York State and pressure her. And I have her phone number, which I would like to announce.
Okay.
It is 518-474-8390.
I hope that is an official phone number, Andrew, and not a personal phone number.
That is the official phone number,
okay.
518-474-8390, extension 3. And the fax number was 518-474-1513.
Although, presumably, you could find any of this by simply going to the newyork.gov website and checking it out.
Yes, you can Google it. It's public information.
Yeah, you might want to start, by trying to get Alvin Bragg to change his mind. Or do you think that that's a lost cause?
Probably. I think it's allegedly corruption that.
Yeah, because the Manhattan DA has, they've got a listed phone number too. Andrew, thanks for the call. I share your outrage. We'll be back. It's 27 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Fair and only slightly unbalanced. We'll be back with your calls on the other side of this break.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner, a memoir. This is from chapter 17, about a little more than a third of the way into the book. At first, the revolution only gave the impression of being an historical event like any other, a matter for the press that might just possibly have some effect on the public mood. The Nazis celebrate January 30th as their day of revolution. They are wrong. There was no revolution on January 30th, 1933, just a change of government. Hitler became chancellor, by no means the Führer of the Nazi regime. The cabinet contained only 2 Nazis apart from him. He swore an oath of allegiance to the Weimar Constitution. The general opinion was that it was not the Nazis who had won, but the bourgeois parties of the right, who had captured, in quotes, the Nazis and held all the key positions in the government. In constitutional terms, events had taken a much more conventional, unrevolutionary course than most of what had happened during the previous 6 months. Outwardly also, the day had no revolutionary aspects, unless one considers a Nazi torchlight procession through Wilhelmstrasse or a minor gunfight in the suburbs that night as signs of a revolution. For most of us outsiders, the experience of January 30th, 1933 was that of reading the papers and the emotions we felt while we were doing so. The morning headline was, "Hitler called to president." That produced a certain nervous, impotent irritation. Hitler had been called to the president in August and November. He had been offered the vice-chancellorship and then the chancellorship. Both times he had set impossible conditions, and both times there had been solemn declarations, "Never again." Each time, "never again" had lasted exactly 3 months. Hitler's opponents in Germany at that time suffered from a compulsive urge to offer him everything he wanted, indefatigably, and at an even cheaper price. Indeed, to press it upon him. It's the same now with his opponents outside Germany. Again and again, this appeasement was formally renounced, and again it gaily reappeared at the crucial moment. Just so today. Then, as now, one's only hope was Hitler's own unreasonableness. Would it not sooner or later exhaust the patience of his opponents? Then, as now, it became apparent that their patience knew no bounds. At midday, the headline said, "Hitler makes impossible demands." We nodded, half reassured. It was only too credible. It would have gone against his nature to ask for less than too much. Perhaps the cup had once more passed from us. Hitler, the last defense against Hitler. At about 5 o'clock, the evening papers arrived. Cabinet of National Unity formed Hitler Reichschancellor. I don't know what the general reaction was. For about a minute, mine was completely correct. Icy horror. Certainly this had been a possibility for a long time. You had to reckon with it. Nevertheless, it was so bizarre, so incredible to read it now in black and white. Hitler, Reichschancellor. For a moment, I physically sensed the man's odor of blood and filth, the nauseating approach of a man-eating animal, its foul, sharp claws in my face. Then I shook the sensation off, tried to smile, started to consider, and found many reasons for reassurance. That evening, I discussed the prospects of the new government with my father. We agreed it had a good chance of doing a lot of damage, but not much chance of surviving very long. A deeply reactionary government with Hitler as its mouthpiece. Apart from this, it did not really differ much from the 2 governments that had succeeded Brüning's. Even with the Nazis, it would not have a majority in the Reichstag. Of course, that could always be dissolved, but the government had a clear majority of the population against it, in particular the working class, which would probably go communist now that the Social Democrats had completely discredited themselves. One could prohibit the communists, but that would only make them more dangerous. In the meantime, the government would be likely to implement reactionary social and cultural measures with some anti-Semitic additions to please Hitler. That would not attract any of its opponents to its side. Foreign policy would probably be a matter of banging the table. There might be an attempt to rearm. That would automatically add the outside world to the 60% of the home population who were against the Hitler government. Besides, who were the people who had suddenly started voting Nazi in the last 3 years? Misguided ignoramuses for the most part, victims of propaganda, a fluctuating mass that would fall apart at the first disappointment. No, all things considered, this government was not a cause for alarm. The only question was what would come after it. It was possible that they would drive the country to civil war. The communists were capable of going on the attack before a prohibition against them came into force. The next day, this turned out to be the general opinion of the intelligent press. It is curious how plausible an argument it is, even today, when we know what came next. How could things turn out so completely different? Perhaps it was just because we were all so certain that they could not do so and relied on that with far too much confidence. So we neglected to consider that it might, if worse came to worse, be necessary to prevent the disaster from happening. Through the whole of February 1933, everything that happened remained a matter for the press. In other words, it took place in an arena that would lose all reality for 99% of the population the moment there were no newspapers. Admittedly, enough occurred in that arena. The Reichstag was dissolved, then in a flagrant breach of the Constitution, Hindenburg also dissolved the Prussian regional parliament. There were fast and furious changes of personnel in the civil service. The book defined Hitler. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. You know, they often say that Republican Senator from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, is the stupidest guy in the entire United States Senate. I get it. Tommy Tuberville gives him a run for his money, but he just came out with what has to be at least the very stupidest idea of the year. Ron Johnson is proposing, you know, there's a shortage of child care workers right now in America. There's a whole bunch of good reasons for that. But he has proposed a solution. His suggestion, any woman in America who's getting any kind of public assistance, you're getting food stamps, you're getting, you know, tuition relief, whatever it may be, you would be forced to go into daycare centers and care for children. Yeah, seriously. This is Ron Johnson's idea. People who had no training, and one of his assistants said, well, it's just like teachers who teach in public schools where their own kids attend. No, it's not. These are not trained professionals. There's no union. This is nuts. There's a whole video about it over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. And welcome back. 35 minutes past the hour, and picking up your calls here. Sherry in Shelton, Washington. Hey, Sherry, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. You know, I think we have to send an indictment regarding Trump. It was an attempted coup, not even counting all the other things. I mean, he isn't really a legitimate president. But we will look feckless, the left, you know, those of us who really care and have been on the ground working. It's like, why? Nothing will matter. Our votes won't matter. Our democracy doesn't matter. It's just like, forget it. Yeah. It is the end of our experiment if we don't take this seriously and make the media watch it.
Yeah, I agree, because if he gets away with it, he won't be the last.
Yeah, and you have to put it in the face of everybody and make the media call it a coup. Yeah. Make the media finally, you know, start telling the truth. Yeah. And it has to be in our faces. I am absolutely before the election. Before the election. Absolutely with you, Sherry. Thank you very much for the call. Lori in Cashiers, North Carolina. Hey, Lori, what's up?
Hi, I was calling about the Jared affair. Yeah. Anyway, these allegations that there was enough information to indict Trump or whatever, they didn't come up until after Jared and Ivanka went in front of the January 6th committee. Oh, that's interesting. And now you're telling me today that he's collecting in Saudi?
Yeah, he's feathering his nest, shall we say. I wonder if Jared and Ivanka are making a break with Daddy. Well, that's what I'm wondering. I mean, they didn't come up with this information until Sunday, and, you know, they just spoke to
the January 6th committee last week and the week before.
Yeah. Very, very.
They sat for hours and hours in front of them.
Very interesting. Good job there, Lori, of putting one and one together. I mean, I don't know why I didn't see that, but you're absolutely right. It's remarkable. Lori, thank you.
I'd like to also put my 2 cents in about Trump being indicted.
Sure.
I think he needs to be indicted. Yeah. Nixon was never indicted. He walked away. His accomplice, Jerry Ford, only got 4 years as presidency, but he should have been indicted for being an accomplice. Yeah, Reagan walked away saying he had Alzheimer's, and then his accomplice, George Bush, only got 4 years because he was Reagan's accomplice.
Right.
And then we have his son, who is a torturer, and now we have no moral standing in the world, in the globe, because of the torturing tactics of Cheney and Bush, and they were never brought to account.
Yep,
It has got to end with Trump, this evil in the GOP. In fact, I think the GOP needs to be abolished, and we need to have a nationwide referendum or something about, do we want democracy or do we want autocracy, and leave it to the people to decide, and then our politicians have to follow that moral direction.
I'm with you. And the guy who apparently, in addition to John Yoo and Jay Bybee, who signed off on Trump's torture, was, a Department of Justice lawyer by the name of Brett Kavanaugh. Although all of his papers from his time in the Bush White House were withheld from the Senate during his confirmation hearings. So we just have essentially leaks suggesting that as opposed to documentation. Lori, thank you for the call. Colleen in Yelm, Washington. Hey, Colleen, what's on your mind today?
So much about Trump, throughout the whole thing. And I just wanted to say that I don't believe he's going to be prosecuted because of all the judges he was able to.
He put more than 200 judges on the federal bench. You think that they will act as, well, actually, he put 3 people on the Supreme Court, too. You think that they will all act as a barrier to bail him out, essentially?
Yes.
Yeah. Makes sense.
But,
makes a lot of sense.
I also wanted to say Trump's been working and getting money from the Russians for a long time. I think in '95 he got the money for the Soho apartments, and then for his casino, the Russians were funding that, and he just had to put his name on it and got 10%. But then they withdrew their money, and he went bankrupt because it was being traced to them, and he's been getting away with murder. And now, the way he has the courts packed, I don't think anything's going to happen to him.
Well, we'll see, Colleen.
But the money he's got in it.
Yeah, but I get what you're saying. I mean, in 2015, his son Eric can't, because questions were being raised about whether American banks would loan to him, and his son Eric came out and said, "We don't need money from American banks. We get all the money we need from Russia." I mean, he was pretty straightforward about it. Yeah. Colleen, thanks for the call. Roberta in Maple Grove, Minnesota. Hey, Roberta, what's up?
I just was wondering, thanks for taking my call, if in the 2022s we come up with this split Senate again, is it beyond imagination to think that Sinema or Manchin or both will pay, switch
parties?
So
my guess is that if the Republicans take the Senate, that probably Manchin and maybe Sinema will become Republicans. But I just, I don't know. I think that, right now the Democrats have the power, so they're staying with the Democratic Party. But there's an interesting diary over on Daily Kos today about, this kind of summarizing a bunch of media pieces over the last week or so about how Democrats are just over it with Joe Manchin. I think a lot of this goes back to, almost 2 weeks ago, I believe it was, the New York Times did a big expose on how corrupt Manchin is, how he had back 20 years ago. Yeah. Yep. There was this coal-fired power plant that used this basically high-cost coal, and he cornered the market on the high-cost coal and cut the deal with the plant and got the permit and all this skeezy stuff. And I think that a lot of Democrats are starting to go, this guy is this is corruption personified. Do we really want to be with this guy? On the other hand, if he were to leave the party right now, nothing could be passed through Congress, because it would put the Senate in the hands of the Republicans altogether. And Manchin has voted with the Democrats on a lot of really important stuff, as has Sinema. So it's not like, they're public enemy number 1 and 2. They're at the moment very, very weak Democrats. But, I get what you're saying. Roberta, thank you for the call. MJ in Seattle. Hey, MJ, what's up?
Good morning. I would like to start with my conclusion, so I don't so I can get it in, and that is that, and then build my case. And my conclusion is that the conservative mind tends to be on one side of the problems we're talking about, people being tantalized and into acting like just crazy, fighting with each other when they never would have 10 years ago. And on the other side, the other mind, I don't have an easy name for it, but I'm going to call it right brain. And so there are people still who see connections between things, who consider, who are not tantalized into great fear and that book that you recommend on what happened in World War II with Germans.
They thought they were free.
That's right.
Book,
we bought it and read it, and it's you can push people towards conservative mind, but if they have the strong, that's left brainedness, and if they have strong right brainedness, it's easy to resist. They see the problems with it.
Right. So your concern is the number of people out there who have authoritarian personalities, basically.
That's right. And when I said conservative mind, I have it written here on my little note to talk to you about. That it's a well documented thing. It's we've observed it. It's been pulled into action many times in history. In Somalia, in Ethiopia, and in Rwanda, and not just in Africa, of course. But these are the UN put together a commission after Rwanda, and they studied what happened, and that there were dormant resentments that certain leaders could call upon, get on the radio. It was a radio-driven massacre.
Slaughter, yeah. No, I'm with you. And I would recommend, if you're looking at, for a book to learn more about this, I would recommend John Dean, Richard Nixon's former White House counsel. He wrote a book called Conservatives Without Conscience. And it's about the authoritarian personality. In fact, he goes back to Bob Altmeier's work on that. MJ, I got to run, but thank you for the call. Spot on. It's 45 minutes past the hour here on the True People's Media, the Thom Hartmann Program. Back with more of your calls right after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archive.
Defending America from the weapons of mass deception. We'll be right back. And welcome back. John in Seattle. Hey, John, what's up?
Thanks, Tom. Well, with the news about Don Jr.'s communications with Mark Meadows on how to overthrow the election, you think Trump is now going to throw Don Jr. under the bus, saying, "Oh, I never thought the election was stolen. It was Don Jr. and Rudy Giuliani who convinced me, not me."
I think that I don't think it's quite that neat and clean, where it's just a yes or no thing and, dump the kid or not. But I think that if it were ever to reach that point, because Trump gave a speech on January 6th, and he was the one who said, we're going to march down to the Capitol, all this kind of stuff. So you'd have a hard time pinning it on his son. But if there was some crime, perhaps even the January 6th crime, but if there was some other crime that he could dump on his son if he himself was looking at going to prison. And I'm thinking here about the tax and bank fraud charges that may be being brought against him. I think he would do it in a heartbeat. I don't think that Donald Trump has loyalty to anybody other than Donald Trump. I think if he could blame something on his wife, he would do it. If he could blame it on his kids, he would do it. Obviously, if it would blame it on former employees, he'd do it in a heartbeat. I just don't think that loyalty is part of his DNA, at all. So,
can I suggest a new acronym for the Republican Party?
Sure.
Total opposition to a democratic society, and the acronym is TOADS.
TOADS. Okay, I got it. John Goodwin, thank you very much. Don in Tacoma, Washington. Hey, Don, what's up?
Hi. It's a lot of talk about Trump. I heard this reprimand from Putin about Finland. He's warning against a bid for joining NATO, I think.
Yeah.
Did you hear about that?
Yeah. Finland has indicated a desire to join NATO, and Putin essentially threatened them. Yeah, that was last week.
Does that mean that Finland is going to be next?
Finland shares a massive border. I mean, virtually the entire country is on the border of Russia. So, and Finland and Russia have gone to war with each other over that border multiple times in the last 100 years. Finland could be next, and Sweden too.
Be next.
Sweden is talking about it. Joining NATO, and Switzerland is now talking about joining NATO.
We're heading towards a World War III, and so we're going to have to buckle down and say, "Hey, look, this is where the line stops."
I think so. I really think so. And the question, I mean, I was reading this morning on Daily Kos that as the Russians they've started the attacks on the Donbass region, on eastern Ukraine, and it looks like the Ukrainians have been making good use of some of this anti-tank weaponry and anti-aircraft weaponry that the West has been providing them. They apparently shot down a Russian fighter jet this morning or yesterday, and they have destroyed a part of this long line of tanks. And, whether Russia is going to be able to pull off this invasion, and seizure, is an open question, which then raises the question, what does Putin do if he's totally back, if he's about to lose, what does he do?
Kind of like what that right brain and left brain discussion was that woman had a while back.
Yeah.
I think Putin's into the right brain part of it. He just can't seem to get out of it.
I think he's way below that. I think he's in the limbic brain or the lizard brain. I think even below the limbic brain. I think he's in the brainstem here. Don, I got to run, but thank you for the call. Spot on. We'll be right back. Hey, I've got a new book out. It's called The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy. Available wherever you find fine books. It's 10 minutes before the hour. Karen in New Orleans. Hey, Karen, what's up?
Hey, Tom. How you doing today?
I'm well.
Good. I believe that there's a bunch of people in this country that have never been taught courtesy or manners, and Trump is the most rudest, crudest, socially unacceptable being I've ever seen, and all of his rallies are filled with these kind of people, and his rude, crude, socially unacceptable behavior, he gave them all permission.
I agree.
To act that way. And they're doing it because they want to act that way. And secondly, this 11-point agenda that Rick Scott put on the Senate floor should be printed and well distributed. It is the best thing that Democrats could have.
Well, and for people who don't know what you're talking about, Rick Scott proposed raising taxes on working class people. He pointed out that about a little over 50% of Americans don't pay income taxes. They do pay, FICA taxes. They do pay Social Security and Medicare taxes, but they don't pay income taxes because they make so little. And Rick Scott said, that's terrible. We need to tax all these people. And now another Republican, Mike Gibbons, he's the leading Republican Senate candidate from Ohio, came out and he said, quote, middle-class Americans don't pay any kind of a fair share of income taxes. He's a multimillionaire investment banker from Cleveland. And he's apparently all in with Rick Scott on this thing, which is, I'm with you. They should be They should be, Democrats should be promoting the hell out of it. I'm completely with you. Thank you very much for the call, Karen. Jake in Elizabeth, Pennsylvania. Hey, Jake, what's up?
Morning, Tom.
Hey.
Like I was telling Joyce, I lived in Saudi for 12, 13 years.
Okay.
And the Beto women have never given up driving ever since automobiles were introduced into that country. They still do to this very day, as far as I know.
You're talking about the Bedouins, not the Saudis.
I was saying, yeah. Well, that's the same peoples.
Okay.
They're not. You know, there's no distinguishing between the two ethnically. They're the same peoples.
Okay. So what's your point, Jake?
Well, the point there is that MBS saying, yeah, okay, it's okay for women to drive now, that only applied to those that were living in the cities in which the Saudis themselves attempted to get all the Bedouins brought in from the desert and stop being desert wanderers. I mean, we visited with a family out in the desert once upon a time. They were as nice to us as any human being could possibly ask for.
Oh, these are hospitality
One of them had just come in from Qatar across the border. He drove the whole way across the sand dunes, and they were nice. They were nice. And, you know, one of them spoke some English, and one of our party spoke some Arabic, so we were able to communicate with pretty well.
Good. Well, I'm glad you had a good experience there, Jake, and thank you for sharing your perspective and your experience. I appreciate it. Zeph in New Orleans. Hey, Zeph, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Hi. I'm a big fan, huge fan. I've been listening for years. I quote you on my Facebook page. I heard the other day you asked, you kind of flummoxed by a question of why the Republicans are afraid of Donald Trump so much. Why do they just cower down to him and everything? And I have a theory about that I'd like to share with you.
Go for it.
Here we go. I'm a big Hillary fan. I really cried the night that election went against her. And I think the Republicans are, I put on my Facebook page, because you hate Hillary, you gave us Satan's apprentice. Mm-hmm. In other words, it was the lesser of two evils for the Republicans, as far as their intellect would allow them to think about it. They are afraid of Hillary so much, and they hate her, and it's really fear, that if she were in power in the White House, and I think she deserves it, you know, and I'm a big Obama fan, but when he announced for president, I said, that's the end of us getting a woman president in my lifetime, really. I think, personally, I'm going to say something a little indelicate. I'm going to say I think Obama should have waited his turn. Hillary could have walked away with that election that Obama took away from
2008,
her because we had Bush and Cheney. Yeah, Bush and Cheney had messed up so bad, nobody was going to vote Republican.
Yep.
After they started that war and lied us into a war, and the whole 9/11 scam with the Saudi Arabians, that was an open door.
And then bailed out the bankers after the crash in 2008.
Yeah, that was an open door for Hillary to walk through, because, you know, Hillary had the hardest row to hoe to become president than any other presidential candidate, man or woman.
Yeah.
And we needed to help her. I think she needed help. And 9/11 gave us the help that we needed to put Hillary in power. And after Obama said, "Oh, I'm gonna walk away. I'm gonna run for president," Dick Durbin, I can't stand him, because he announced he got Obama to he pushed him ahead of the line. He should have stayed as the state senator, in my opinion, in Illinois.
I get all that, but that's kind of ancient history, Zeph. In the 20 seconds we've got left, what does this have to do with why Trump, still intimidates Republicans?
Well, because the Republicans, the worst thing that could have happened to the Republicans is Hillary winning the election. They hate her so much. Can you imagine her being in the White House lecturing to the Republicans? Their heads would explode. They'd all go insane. Yeah. That's my theory.
Well, I think part of it is Hillary hatred, and part of it is just good old-fashioned misogyny. I think that you'll see the same thing, the same dynamic, if it's Kamala Harris who's running, or any woman who's running. And it's going to be a real challenge. I mean, it's true that women, any minority, anybody other than white men have to work much, much harder to do the exact same thing that white men can do. It's sad, but it's real. And you know, we're doing something about it step by step, but it's taking time. Zeb, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be back. I want to get into this question. Greg Blustein is actually going to be with us. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The hidden history of Big Brother in America, how the death of privacy and the rise of surveillance threaten us and our democracy, by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at cozyearth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at hartmanreport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at dinovite.com.
Today we're reading about Thunderdome politics, an uncivil war taking back our democracy in an age of Trumpian disinformation and Thunderdome politics by Greg Sargent, the Washington Post columnist. This is from his chapter on voter suppression. It's page 37. Republicans and Democrats inhabit different political realities, as mentioned in a previous chapter. But there are certain facts about our politics that are just objectively true. One of them is this. Generally speaking, efforts to make it harder to vote are almost always pushed by Republicans. You cannot understand what is happening in American politics right now without recognizing this stark and very fundamental difference between the two major political parties. During this decade, procedural hurdles were put into place in around 20 states that in some manner or other have made it harder to vote or to register to vote, or have undone previous efforts to make voting or registering easier, or have otherwise threatened serious disenfranchisement. Most of them were the creation of Republican lawmakers and officials. The difference in the two parties' national platforms for 2016 tells the story. The GOP platform champions additional hurdles that are absurdly disproportionate to the phantom abuse it alleges, while the Democratic platform champions multiple specific ways to make it easier to vote, not harder. The most common and controversial of methods used by Republicans to suppress Democratic turnout is the requirement that would-be voters present identification at the polls. The game here tends to turn on requiring forms of ID that some groups are less likely to have, making participation harder for them. Other restrictions include techniques like cutting back on early voting and making it harder to register, both of which have, in recent years, been instituted in multiple states. Republicans who have passed laws making it harder to vote have tended to claim such measures are necessary to protect against, quote, voter fraud. We'll look at this in more detail below, but for now, note that most of the states that have passed such measures did so while under Republican control. As New York University political scientist Samuel Isikoff has memorably put it, the single predictor necessary to determine whether a state will impose voter access restrictions is whether Republicans control the ballot access process. Scholars trace the modern era of warfare over election rules to the intensely contested presidential election of 2000. in which a divided Supreme Court halted the recount in Florida, throwing the presidency to George W. Bush. The closeness and partisan acrimony of that contest, combined with the intense national focus on election rules that accompanied the court battle over it, helped persuade both parties to invest much more attention and energy on those rules. As a result, both the implementation of measures restricting the ballot and the legal battles over them have intensified in recent years. A brief glance at the surprising history of voter ID laws begins to tell the story of this tightening. In the 1970s, several states implemented voter ID measures, but all of them provided for ways that voters without the proper ID could cast a ballot. By 2000, there were 14 such laws, and they had been implemented by politicians in both parties. But by the mid-2000s, amid rising post-2000 acrimony, a handful of red states began implementing voter ID laws that the nonpartisan National Conference of State Legislatures described as, quote, strict, meaning that they make it easy to disqualify those who don't pass muster. After one of those laws in Indiana was challenged and then upheld in 2008 by the Supreme Court, an escalation began that gained momentum in the Obama era. From 2010 onward, the adoption of voter ID laws in general, and of strict ones in particular, accelerated. Though a handful were blocked in the courts, as of this writing, a total of 34 states have voter ID laws in effect, 24 that are deemed non-strict and 10 that are deemed strict. The strict ones are in red states or in swing states where they were implemented by Republicans. The story is very similar if you evaluate the state's voting rules in a broader way, by including not just voter ID measures, but also cutbacks to early voting and restrictions on registration. Here the trend is just as pronounced. After the 2010 elections, the Brennan Center for Justice documented a sharp rise in efforts to pass such measures in the state legislatures across the country. Not all these efforts bore fruit, but many did. By the time voting took place in Election Day 2016, some 14 states had these new restrictions in place for the first time in a presidential election. Now, as of this writing, by the Brennan Center's count, some 20 states have successfully implemented either strict voting ID requirements or cutbacks to early voting or restrictions on registration or other measures with meaningful disenfranchising effects. If you're a liberal who's frustrated by the seemingly unbreakable Republican dominance of national politics, not to mention GOP control of most state governments across the country, then the chances are that these restrictions figure heavily into your explanation of this GOP supremacy. Indeed, social media has been absolutely saturated in recent years with variations of the lament that Republican political dominance is largely maintained through a combination of nefarious and undemocratic tactics, such as ballot restrictions that keep constituencies unfriendly to the GOP from voting, and extreme gerrymanders that have, in effect, built a fortress around the GOP's majority in the House of Representatives. Democrats frequently invoke the GOP's use of these tactics, often justifiably, to raise money and to galvanize turnout. This narrative contains some important truths. Some of the forms that these restrictions on voting access have taken in recent years are diabolically obvious in their efforts to keep constituencies supportive of Democrats from voting. Still others boast the distinction of being more insidiously designed and thus less obvious in their intentions. The book is An Uncivil War by Greg Sargent of The Washington Post.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is Greg Blustein. He's a political reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the host of the Politically Georgia podcast, and the author of a new book, Flipped, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. Greg, welcome to his Twitter handle, by the way, is Blustein, Bluestein. And on Twitter and on the website ajc.com for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Greg, welcome to the program. So glad to have you with us. If we could start out with, are you there, Greg, by the way?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm not hearing Greg.
Can't wait to talk.
You're hearing him? Hello? Okay.
Yes.
There, now I can hear you. Okay. Let me start out with, what was the lay of the land in Georgia politics? I lived in Georgia for over a decade, but that was back in the 80s. What was the lay of the land in Georgia politics at the time that Stacey Abrams started becoming a serious force in Georgia politics?
Yeah, well, the lay of the land for Democrats in Georgia was bleak. Republicans had won every statewide office, had a commanding majority in the House delegation, both Senate seats, as well as big majorities in the Georgia legislature, almost a supermajority in the Georgia legislature over the past decade or so before things started becoming more competitive. And it was Stacey Abrams who started that process, that painstaking process of galvanizing, energizing, recruiting activists and volunteers and voters, showing them that, hey, there's a pathway forward for Democrats who want to stick to authentic messages, not just by trying to run to be a Republican-light candidates.
So was the essence of what Stacey Abrams was doing bringing up the Democratic vote among people who were not registered to vote? In other words, just increasing participation, engaging the base?
It was engaging the base in new ways, right? There was work to register voters who weren't registered, but many voters were already registered. They just felt disconnected, alienated, disenchanted with the political process. These were voters that rarely voted at all, and if they did, they voted in presidential elections, but skipped primaries and certainly skipped midterm elections. They felt like they didn't have a reason to vote. And Stacey Abrams and her allies, a network of activists and volunteers, realized that the only way to engage them, to get them energized and mobilized to vote, was not by repeating the sort of Republican-light messages that some other Democrats had. And that was the conventional wisdom at the time for Democrats to run away from national figures, to run away from gun control issues and criminal justice reform issues, and instead, talk about broad-based things like expanding Medicaid that were popular across party lines, but not lean into progressive issues. Stacey Abrams showed that there was a pathway to energize those voters by leaning into typically liberal issues that the Democrats stayed away from.
So for people who are not familiar with Stacey Abrams, where would you place her politically, and give us a little background on her, but where would you place her politically on the spectrum of, the Democratic Party spectrum of, let's say, from, Bill Clinton neoliberalism to Bernie Sanders progressive populism?
Yeah, that's a really interesting scale. I'd probably put her 7-ish in terms of liberal scale. She's very liberal, but she also has a very deeply rooted pragmatic streak. Mm-hmm. She is the former House Minority Leader of the state of Georgia, so she was the leading Democrat in the Georgia House for years. She's a tax lawyer, a businesswoman, and a political activist who has made no bones about it. She's not shy about it at all. She wants to be president one day. She wanted to be Joe Biden's running mate. She has higher aspirations than Georgia governor, but right now, Georgia governor has been her dream for as far back as when she was a teenager, and has always aspired to do so. But as I mentioned, early on, especially in her legislative career, she had a pragmatic streak. She would work with Republicans to make legislation, in her view, better. When there was a big push to cut the Hope Scholarship Award, which is a very popular scholarship, lottery-funded scholarship in Georgia that I went to school on. If you kept a B average, you got tuition paid for. When there was a push to cut that because of increasing demand and sort of flat lottery revenues, she worked with Republicans to soften the blow, and got a lot of pushback from Democrats that she wasn't more aggressive, that she would work across party lines. So even though she is this progressive and liberal icon to many, she has shown that she can work across party lines in the past.
We're talking with Greg Blustein about his new book, Flipped, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. Greg, Georgia has a large black population. Stacey Abrams is a black woman. To what extent are the lessons that we can learn from Stacey Abrams' candidacy and the campaign and the success of her efforts, to what extent are those transportable to a state that has a very small black population with perhaps a white progressive candidate?
It's a good question. I think overall, it's the authenticity of the message. The Democrats were trying to run as candidates as candidates for issues that they didn't truly engage or believe in a sense, right?
For example,
in past years. Well, Democrats stayed away from gun control. Democrats were run as NRA Democrats, not because that's the way they viewed it, but it's because they thought that, and that was the conventional wisdom at the time, so I don't think their thinking was all that wrong, but they thought that in 2014 and 2012 and 2010, that if they embraced gun control, it would be a campaign ender for their
NRA would take them down.
The NRA would take them down in a state like Georgia, where NRA is still very powerful, where Second Amendment issues are still very resonant among particularly conservative voters, but even some voters who are kind of more in the middle of the road. So it took sort of that 2018 campaign from Stacey Abrams to say, hey, you can campaign on legalizing marijuana, for instance, and that's another example. You can campaign on bringing more economic equality by talking about tax cuts and tax credits for lower income Georgians, not just for middle income and higher income Georgians, but also for lower income Georgians. And then you can talk about gun control, and it wouldn't be a campaign doomer right off the bat.
How does abortion play in all this?
You know, abortion is another one of those issues that Democrats in Georgia tiptoed around probably more like 2 decades ago than more recently. But Stacey Abrams and other Democratic candidates, especially in the last 4 or 5 years, have put that at the center of their campaign arguments. Brian Kemp, one of the first major legislative acts that he did was sign into law one of the most sweeping, far-reaching abortion restrictions in the nation in Georgia in 2019. It immediately got blocked in the federal court system. But even by signing that bill that he calls the heartbeat law into law, sent a message to Democrats, too, that, hey, this is not some squishy conservative, a moderate. This is not some middle-of-the-road Republican. He is going to fulfill his campaign promises because he ran just as Stacey Abrams embraced the left, Brian Kemp didn't necessarily move to the middle in 2018 either. He continued to embrace the right.
Yeah. You have this whole hysteria, this moral panic that's going on right now around schools and LGBTQ people and issues, and the main group that the Republicans are beating up on are trans people. But now they're going. I mean, they've gone into weird land. How is that playing out in Georgia?
Yeah, in a major way. I mean, culture wars have entered the classrooms in Georgia. And I'm glad you mentioned transgender legislation, because that was the one piece of Governor Kemp's legislative agenda that I didn't think would necessarily make it across the finish line. Our legislative session just ended last week. And in the final minutes of the legislative session, lawmakers passed a measure that would ultimately would let high school officials block transgender students from competing in high school sports. So Georgia's going to, in some form or fashion, join the ranks of those other states that have taken that step. But it wasn't just that. There was legislation that would ban or seek to control how teachers talk about race and gender in the classroom. It would allow more parents say in what books should be allowed to be taught in Georgia public schools and which shouldn't. And other legislation that even sought to control how higher education, how professors taught about critical race theory and others. That legislation didn't pass, that last one I mentioned, but just the very fact that it was being sponsored or being talked about was seen to Democrats as a threat.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. The book is called Flipped, How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power. The author, Greg Blustein, Bluestein, is his Twitter handle. He's a reporter with the Atlanta Constitution Journal and the host of the Politically Georgia podcast. Greg, thanks a lot for dropping by. Great talking with you.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It's 15 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So, time to nationalize the fossil fuel industry. What do you think will happen if Trump is indicted? What are the takeaways from France? Did Jared Kushner get $2 billion for selling out Khashoggi? All kinds of issues here that we can talk about. Mr. C in Los Angeles. Hey, Mr. C, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people have said it many times that we need to get money out of politics, but nothing's ever done. What is the solution of getting money out of politics?
Well, actually, we sort of did this in the 70s after the Nixon bribery scandals. Jerry Ford signed into law a number of laws that limited the amount of campaign contributions, that limited the activity of PACs and super PACs, just a whole bunch of good stuff there. And all of that got thrown out by the U.S. Supreme Court with the Citizens United, and virtually all of it, not all of it, but most of it. And, frankly, I think that the Congress just needs to take on the Supreme Court and say, we're going to pass these laws, and we're going to include in these laws a statement that the Supreme Court can't rule on them. It's our opinion these are constitutional.
Yeah, Supreme Court, the government, everybody's supposed to be working for us.
Okay. Yeah.
For the people. But what happens, they're not working for us.
No, they're not. They're working for themselves, and they're working for their own reelection, and they're working for the big money behind them. Mr. C, spot on. Thank you very much. Les in Glendale, California. Hey, Les, what's up?
Hi. I think it is imperative that we indict Trump. And I have often said that I sort of blame, in part, Nancy Pelosi for creating Trump, in the sense that they would not hold the Bush administration accountable for any of their wrongdoings. And I think that the Democrats saying, well, that's the past and we're going to move forward, it just allowed the bad behavior to continue. If you don't set limits on a child, if you've got an unruly child who misbehaves and there's never any consequences, they're just going to escalate and get worse. Yeah. And I think that's what's happened with the Republican Party.
Yeah, and Trump is your original unruly child.
Yes.
And he's modeling this behavior, and it's being imitated now by Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and all these other grifters inside the Republican Party. And there's a few, the Mitt Romneys and the Liz Cheneys of the GOP who are stepping back, going, I don't think so. But I think the big question here, Les, and would love to hear your thoughts on this, is whether the Republican Party is going to have a reckoning, whether they're going to have a head-first collision with rationality and reality, or whether they're going to continue to be able to live in this bizarre little bubble that they've created for themselves.
I just don't see it. The Republicans are so hard, so dyed in the wool, and so committed to disrupting all of this. I mean, I remember listening to Rush Limbaugh 20 years ago, when there was no progressive, when you and Randy weren't around to listen to. I didn't believe Rush. But he at that time, 20 years ago, said, Democrats are trying to destroy America. And, of course, it's really the Republicans that were trying to do it. And he said, we're going to take it down, and we're going to even do everything we can to end the FDR New Deal stuff.
Yeah, and they did. I mean, they have. Yeah. I mean, that's been the essence of it. I'm with you. Les, thanks a lot for the call. Spot on. Whew. It's 20 minutes past the hour. I'll be back with your calls on the other side of this break. 202-808-9925. We'll be right back. Change starts with you. You can be calling your Democratic or Republican representatives to let them know what you think by calling 202-224-3121. It's the Capitol switchboard. It'll get you right through to them. So did you hear the story about the three white guys, 22, 24 years old, who just pleaded guilty to trying to attack power grids in 3 different parts of the United States? According to the Justice Department, their scheme was that they were going to bring down electricity for 3 basically major cities or major regions of the United States. And the theory of this program is sort of like what Tim McVeigh was all about back in 1990, I think it was 3, when he blew up the federal building. Their scheme was that doing so, cutting off the power to these cities. Well, this is from the Department of Justice. Quote, the defendants believed their plan would cost the government millions of dollars and cause unrest for Americans in the region. They had conversations about how the possibility of the power being out for months would cause a race war and induce the next Great Depression. They had suicide pills and everything. Why aren't we talking about white terrorism in America? There's a video about this over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. It's 21 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We talked with Greg Blustein about how Georgia is flipping purple. Do you think the rest of the country is moving in that direction? Is it possible? Can we really bring the Democratic Party along? We'll see. We'll see. Charles in Miami, Florida. Hey, Charles, what's on your mind today?
Hey, love your show, Tom.
Thank you, Charles.
I'd like to give a shout out to Morris from Long Beach, Norma from Alabama, Larry from LA, and I'd just like to say you guys inspire me also Jeff from Portland. You guys inspire me every time I listen to Tom. Thank you so much. I'm calling today because unfortunately I had to disagree with you, Tom.
Oh, go for it, Charles.
It's been on my mind for a little minute now because of the gas prices, and I think, no, we should nationalize. I think what we should do is have our own American oil company that's going to drill oil for the government and just distribute that through gas stations to people. What we can do is lower the price of oil. I think we would be the competition for the big oil companies, and I think you can hire a lot of minorities also. You can do it in certain parts of the country. And the best part about it, what I like though about my plan, is that I want to have so many different environmentalists involved. I want to have so many studies involved. I even want to have film and video of when we do have like oil spill or something like that. I want to study it. I want to publish it. I want people to know exactly what we don't see through private enterprise, what the public would be, would have a focus on. Mm-hmm. And that's my thing, because I think the game is rigged. I thought about it right after the coronavirus pandemic, and Saudi Arabia decided to flood the market with their oil and put everybody else out of business. That means only one thing: they have a monopoly, and they determine the price at any time they want to. So basically, we're stuck with this. And the reason why I want to do this, because I am into green energy, and I do think once we control this sort of enterprise, that we can eventually, not eventually, but quickly enough, we can make a point that, hey, we need green energy. And it doesn't have, let's say this thing doesn't have to work all the time, but in a moment of crisis like this, where we feel like, we have to open up the reserves, then I think that's when we should start pumping oil. And last but not least, I would like to say, Tom, that if you allow me to call back on Friday, if it's okay, I would like to just talk about, with the minimum wage, companies, corporations are always saying, no, we can't allow you to, we can't raise the minimum wage because we're going to raise prices on everything and we're going to fire people. Well, guess what? After the big quit this summer, corporations and companies have raised pay rates, right? Mm-hmm. And now that these corporations are saying that, they're gouging it. They're the ones that's doing it, and now they're blaming it on Biden. I think they are, just like always, they're very insidious, and they like to point the blame at everybody else, but they're being greedy right now. Every little gain that we've made so far, they're shaking it out of us. Thank you, Tom. Love you so much.
Well, Charles, this is one of the points that I was making in my op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com is that the oil companies are actually manipulating the price of oil both for profits and also for political purposes, jacking up the price of oil. So, I get what you're saying about we should have an American oil company. I completely understand that, but it would take years to build out the infrastructure and hire the people and everything else. Whereas you could nationalize ExxonMobil by simply making an offer to buy, half their stock at a price a little bit above the market price right now, and just, acquire it in the open marketplace. You could nationalize that company tomorrow.
Well, the thing is this. I love all our agencies. I don't want to shut anyone down. I don't want them to privatize. I believe they belong to the people. And if we have government agencies that's monitoring them, that's regulating it, mm-hmm. I just feel like once the public is more aware, we can see what's going on, because you won't see on a private company what they do in an oil spill. Like Rachel had to show us one time, and I think it was in Michigan, they had an oil spill, and they just covered it up,
Kalamazoo,
but they didn't stop it, and it was just going into, you have to expose this stuff, and there's no one else going to do it but our government itself. So No, we need this. We need this, Tom. Please think about it, okay?
Okay, I got it, Charles. Thank you. So, should we nationalize oil in the United States? And what do you think would happen or will happen if it happens that Donald Trump is indicted? What happens if Kushner is indicted? Did he get $2 billion from the Saudis just for selling us out? What say you?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And do you think it's possible that one of the reasons Americans are behaving so weirdly, not just from the role model of Donald Trump, but because the news has become clickbait?
Our book today is Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee. This is from the first chapter, Jailbreak Out of History, Harriet. Focus on Amazons, about why we deal with real women as myths, girls who never really existed. Yet and again, all are around us, and that we can't bring ourselves to see. Because seeing through white men's eyes is about non-vision of ourselves. So let's deal with a real Amazon. Think about Harriet Tubman. Take 6 months. In fact, take a year and think. Break it on down. What does it mean to be the most famous new African woman in U.S. history? What does it mean to be stuck in that lie? What's the meaning of being famous while being hidden and disfigured and dissed? Let's jailbreak Harriet Tubman out of white history and place her in Amazon and new African her story, her people's story. Harriet Tubman's life is a live weapon placed in our minds, showing us what it means to be an Amazon, which is why the capitalist patriarchy has forbidden us to touch on it for so long. In this, maybe for the first time, we can see Amazons as a future force in a clash of peoples and nations, not as myths, but as players in the whole difficult course of world politics. We can also appreciate the bittersweet tang of reality as the peeling away of layers of propaganda and disfigurement which have hidden Harriet from us exposes how much we assume and how little we have known. New African women have already pointed out the significant pattern of Harriet's exclusion. Cultural critic Bell Hooks said recently, if we could recover Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman to the extent that we've recovered, say, Zora Neale Hurston, I think that's an important contrast because people want to bury that revolutionary black female history. Historian Deborah Gray White connects Harriet's treatment to a larger pattern in the mainstream history of slavery, in which black women, quote, were reduced to insignificance and largely ignored, end quote. In examining the influential historian Stanley Elkins, she points out, quote, that Elkins seems to omit women altogether was accentuated by his description of slaves whom he identified as part of an American underground, those who never succumbed to Samboism. Among those mentioned were Gabriel, who led the revolt of 1820, Denmark Vesey, leading spirit of the 1822 plot at Charleston, and Nat Turner, an omission conspicuous by its absence, was Harriet Tubman. If Elkins had really been thinking of slaves of both sexes, he would hardly have forgotten this woman, who became widely known as the Moses of her people, end of quote. Patriarchal capitalisms, which only want Amazons to be exotic myths about forgotten ages, have hidden Harriet Tubman in her own fame. They both trivialize and exceptionalize her. These are tools of oppressor culture. The stripped down and censored version of her life is told in elementary schools all over the U.S. empire. So much so that everyone thinks they know her story already, although they don't. Harriet Tubman was born in slavery in Maryland around 1820. She escaped to the North when she was 29, but kept returning secretly to the South again and again to help other slaves escape. For this, she became known as Moses. True statements. But by limiting her, it becomes clever propaganda against her and against her people. Where patriarchy has been unable to deny that women do significant things, it denies the full meaning of what we do by trivializing them. Mary Daly, feminist philosopher, traces the enormity of what patriarchy has done to us. In ancient Greece, the goddess Hecate, also known as Artemis and Diana, was sometimes known as Trivia and represented by a three-faced statue. That was also the name used for the intersection of three paths, which in many old cultures were the sites of mystical power. She writes in Gynecology, quote, "In light of the cosmic significance of the term trivia as the crossing of the three roads and of the goddess who bears this name, contemporary meaning of the term in English should be examined. The English term, which according to Merriam-Webster is derived from the Latin trivium or crossroads, is defined as common, ordinary, commonplace, of little worth or importance, insignificant, flimsy, minor, or slight. Of course, according to patriarchal values, that which is commonplace is of little worth. For in a competitive hierarchical society, scarcity is intrinsic to worth. Thus, gold is more important than fresh air, and consequently, we are forced to live in a world in which gold is easier to find than pure air." End quote. So to trivialize Harriet Tubman, the capitalist patriarchy pictures her as an idealized woman by their definition, who makes a life of helping others. Thus, her deeds are squeezed into women's assigned maternal role as nurturer, helper, and rescuer of men, who then go on to do important things. But Harriet wasn't repping Mother Teresa. She wasn't even any kind of civilian at all. She was a combatant, a guerrilla, a warrior carrying pistol and rifle, fighting in her people's long war for freedom, a war that rocked the foundations of African society, American society, and that has never gone away. Think about what it means to be called Moses, which was the code name other new Africans gave her, and which became Harriet's famous warrior name in the anti-slavery underground. When we check out the Bible, we can see that Moses was a ruthless visionary, someone who forced the boldest changes and risks upon his people so that they could survive, who led them out of captivity. To put it simply, Moses was a leader in a time of war. So too was Harriet Tubman. The book, Jailbreak Out of History by Butch Lee.
Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. 27 Republican senators sent a letter to the Energy Secretary, Jennifer Granholm, echoing talking points that the American Petroleum Institute pushed out on Twitter recently, saying that basically if we're going to stop importing Russian oil into the United States, which, by the way, the Russian oil imports into the U.S. are just a trickle. It's just a tiny drop in the bucket. If we're going to stop doing that, we need to, and these are some quotes from the API Twitter, we need to unleash America's energy. We need to release permits for energy development on federal lands. We need to issue offshore leasing plans for the next 5 years. We need to accelerate energy permitting infrastructure. We need to reduce regulatory and legal uncertainty. Right. It's a scam. And these 27 Republican senators are owned by the big fossil fuel companies because the Supreme Court allowed it with their Citizens United decision. We have to do something about this. There's a whole video rant about it over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. "35 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. I just want to flag one thing for you here. Another story about the corruption that happened while Donald Trump was in the White House. There is a law that says that when the President of the United States is given a gift by a foreign government, that becomes the property of the United States. And if it's worth more than $400 and change. And if the president decides to keep it, there's a whole song and dance you got to go through, and all the gifts have to be cataloged and things like that. And all kinds of expensive stuff has come into the White House during the 4 years that Donald Trump was president. But the State Department is about to publish a report in the Federal Register this week, basically saying that Trump and Kushner, Kushner got these swords from Saudi Arabia and all this other stuff, and leopard skins, and that Trump and the people around him took all these gifts, and we've got no record of them. Sorry. Don't have any idea, don't know, can't tell you, haven't seen it, don't know what's going on. Don't know what happened to those 15 boxes of stuff that Trump spirited down to Mar-a-Lago, including all kinds of top secret documents that he apparently then invited, foreign people to come in and look through. Very strange stuff. I mean, we know that he was actually showing them to just like random people at Mar-a-Lago. Richard Painter, who was the ethics chief, the guy who oversaw this stuff for the George W. Bush administration, good Republican, Richard Painter, he says it's flagrant and it looks terrible. He said this to the New York Times. He says it was either really stupid or really corrupt. It wasn't, though, Trump who had to make these decisions. It was Trump appointees. So I would say it was really corrupt. In fact, Joyce Vance said the only reason you don't keep the perfunctory records that every administration is readily equipped to keep is because you intend to violate the law. Yeah, that's called really corrupt. So how long is Trump going to be able to get away with this? I don't know. We'll see. Anyhow, picking up your calls here, John in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, longtime fan. Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you've heard anything about when the televised hearings for the January 6th committee are going to take place. I haven't heard much at all lately.
I have not. And I know back in January, they were talking about in the spring, and now they're talking about in the summer. My guess is that they don't want to compete with the war in Ukraine for coverage. And so they're looking for kind of a quiet time when they can do that. So, you know, the best guess is this will probably resolve over the next month or so. And that therefore the hearings might start in May or June. But I just don't know. I mean, they do want, and for very good reasons, they do want the American people to see what they're doing. And it's right now is you've got a news environment where it's tough to get anything that pops above the, you know, another 10,000 people massacred by the Russians.
Yeah, very true. Do you think these will have anywhere near the impact that the Watergate hearings had?
I doubt it. And the main reason is because when the Watergate hearings happened, there were only 3 television networks. And, you know, they were carried by all 3 of them. Sam Irving's hearings were anyway in the Senate. And, you know, now you've got all kinds of different networks. You know, Fox almost certainly will not carry any of it. So people can still live in their little media bubbles. And so I'm sure it won't have the impact that those hearings had, but it will have impact. The question is, will it influence the elections this fall? Will it reflect poorly on Republicans more generally? And, or is it going to produce a backlash that's going to turn out even more of Trump's base? And I don't have answers to those questions. I just don't know. My guess is it will hurt Trump more than it will help him, but there are Trumpy people who are actually looking forward to it. So we'll see. We'll see. John, thanks a lot for the call. Great to hear from you. Brian in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Hey, Brian, what's on your mind today?
Hey, good day. I want to comment on the lack of prosecution against Trump. I really feel that people are afraid of blackmail. Because let's remember, I mean, I read David K. Johnson's book, and I've read a lot of things. Trump's been in league with organized crime from the get-go. His whole family has. And it's proven. And I think that the establishment politicians in both parties are fearful that Trump's criminal syndicate would dig up or has evidence and dirt of a lot of things in both parties that a lot of the stars, the power centers in both parties, he could go scorched earth and decimate them. Like Jeffrey Epstein, for instance. There's been stories that he has tons and tons of video and photos and evidence of all the people that went down to his island in the Virgin Islands and wherever else. And I think a lot of people are shaking in their boots that criminals have that evidence. And if things go the way they don't want, all that evidence is going to get released to the New York Post and everywhere else. And we know that Bill Clinton was on his plane a lot, but outside of that, I've not heard of any Democratic politicians. And I mean, Clinton is an old guy now. Most of your politicians who are coming up now, and a lot of your Democratic politicians, I realize there's a few old folks in the Senate, but most of them are young enough that they were not part of that whole Epstein party crowd back in the 70s and 80s. Right, but I think for instance, one of the biggest problems the Democrats have is Chuck Schumer, the representative of Wall Street. He is the senator for Wall Street. Right. So he stops a lot of good things that could happen because Wall Street doesn't want it. That's just one example. And then who knows how Chuck's bread's getting buttered these days. I mean, we don't know, but maybe Trump and his criminal associates. Yeah,
that's not going to take down Chuck Schumer, though. I mean, he's had primary opponents saying that kind of stuff for a long time.
But most of the ones that have been there for decades, I think a lot of them have done some underhanded things that weren't quite cricket. and don't want the public to know about. And if they really put Trump to the wall, he's going to go scorched earth, and both parties are going to regret it. And I think that's what's holding it up.
Yeah. Well,
So
it's not entirely impossible, Brian. I mean, there may be something to what you're saying. We'll see. Thank you very much for the call. CJ in Madison, Wisconsin. Hey, CJ, you wanted to weigh in on nationalizing the oil industry?
Yeah, thanks for taking my call, Tom. I respect you, don't always agree with you, but I'd like an ongoing dialogue with you. I'm libertarian, but I usually vote Republican because I believe in capitalism and competition. And the fact that we're living right now in a Democrat-controlled, progressive world, President Biden and Harris, Vice President Harris, campaigned as moderates, and they're governing as progressive socialists. Day one, he went to war with American energy companies with an executive order. He campaigned on shutting down American energy. This is Biden's problem. It's his fault. And why would a company who's got a lease start drilling when the president promises to shut them down? There's no interest in the energy companies when this president and vice president have campaigned since day one on and look at the border. Now they're promising 18,000 immigrants a day, and they've lost control at 7.
So I thought we were talking about oil and privatization here, CJ, rather than a long litany of Fox News talking points. The fact of the matter is that the fossil fuel industry is killing us. It is literally killing us. And it's being run in a way that is going to continue killing us. This industry for 40 years has been hiding the science that they themselves knew. For 40 years, they have been funding BS climate scientists out there trying to cover up the fact that they knew that their product was destroying our atmosphere.
Come on, Tom.
CJ, I'm telling you the truth, and you know it.
No, you're not.
You have a criminal industry here that is responsible for the death of thousands of Americans. 10,000 Americans die every year just from cancers that they get from tailpipe emissions, not to mention the climate damage. And this president said he's going to do something about that, and that's got you all upset. CJ, I'm sorry. This is not a rational conversation. Jim in Vida, Montana. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, Tom, you haven't mentioned mineral rights.
Okay.
As far as the fossil fuel industry, the oil companies, they're making record profits. But what about the guys that own the mineral rights? You should see this. I mean, some of these guys are getting 5-6 figure checks a month for doing nothing, and they don't even live around it. They don't have to put up with the pollution and the noise and the dust and everything. And you know how that works, mineral rights?
Yes, I do. And that was kind of cleaved into law in the last half of the 1900s, or the 1800s, the 19th century. And so what are you suggesting as an alternative? I mean, in some countries, you basically don't own mineral rights at all. They're the property of the country. In the United States, the mineral rights are generally the property of the property owner.
That's what I would
solution?
say. The mineral rights should belong to the country as a whole, and the landowner owns the surface rights only.
Yeah. You could build a good case for that, Jim, but it would be insanely disruptive. I mean, it would because so much of our economy and our legal systems have been structured around the fact that mineral rights are privately ownable, as it were. I doubt that there would be much change, but similarly, I doubt that anybody is going to nationalize the oil industry any day soon, even though I'm calling for it. So we can both make this argument. Jim, thanks a lot for the call. It's 46 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
With more of your calls, your thoughts on the issues of the day right after this. And welcome back. Vox.com has done a fascinating deep dive. It's titled What We Know About the Hunter Biden Investigation. This is by Andrew Prokop. And they're talking about federal prosecutors. Now, this is a prosecution that was initiated during the Trump administration. And according to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, ABC, CBS, CNN, and AP, they have all done stories saying that the U.S. Attorney's Office in Delaware has gotten increasingly active, and there's a grand jury that's looking into Hunter Biden. And Andrew Prokop writes, the investigation focuses on Hunter Biden's well-compensated work for foreign interests over the past decade or so, particularly for businesses or tycoons in Ukraine, China, and Kazakhstan. And the main legal question appear to be whether he violated tax laws, committed money laundering, or acted as an unregistered foreign agent. On top of that, there are the ethical questions about Hunter's foreign consulting and investment work, which began around the time that his father was selected as vice president and continued throughout the Obama years. And, critics have said that he's trading on his dad's name. But the prosecutors are looking into some of these things that date back in some form to the Obama administration. It's a fascinating topic, and why is he being investigated? They say for pretty much his adult life he's been in the business of being Joe Biden's son, basically. At the age of 26, he took a high-paying job at a bank in Delaware, one of Biden's largest donors. 5 years later, he became a lobbyist, and then when his father became vice president, he moved into this world of consulting. I guess the question, let's say that all of this is absolutely true. Assume kind of a worst case situation that Hunter Biden is corrupt or has been trading on his father's name and, made a few $million doing it. What does that do to Democratic politics? What does that do to Joe Biden? What does that do to the guy in the White House? Are people going to say, well, Hunter is a grifter and Jared is a grifter and Jared made $2 billion and Hunter made $3 million? Or are they going to say, and they're both terrible, but, Hunter just wasn't as good as Jared at being a grifter? Or are they going to just, pursue this whole thing in a vacuum? I don't know. It's an interesting question. And an interesting question about whether this story, which is now making its way into mainstream media, the media had largely ignored the Hunter Biden story since the election, so almost 2 years ago, and even before that, because it was perceived as just a political attack on Joe Biden. Now that it's looking like hey, there's a there. The question is, what impact is it going to have? Excuse me. Forgive me. And I guess we're just going to have to see how it shakes out. But my guess is that it's not going to be a big deal. I think that most Americans, after all the corruption of the Trump years, I think most Americans are just kind of immune to it. But anyhow, we'll pick up the conversation right after this. Stick around. It's 10 minutes before the hour. Share the Thom Hartmann Program with your friends. We're available on SiriusXM, Free Speech TV, Pacifica, commercial stations nationwide, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, on the Thom Hartmann app, and you can even tell your smart speaker to listen to the Thom Hartmann Program. So how do you know which party has the most crooks in it? The Republicans are always saying, oh, those Democrats are soft on crime and, a lot of murders in Democrat-run cities. Well, for the record, first off, red states and red counties have a higher per capita murder rates than do blue states and blue counties. It's just a fact. But secondly, let's look at some of the administrations. I mean, the Obama administration had no criminal indictments. The Jimmy Carter administration had 1. The Bill Clinton administration had 2. But what about the Republicans? So welcome back, picking up your calls, 51 minutes past the hour. And James in Chicago. Hey, James, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how are you today?
I am well. What's on your mind?
I was just commenting on Jim, the guy who's the libertarian who called in.
Yeah.
You know, it's amazing how they can always say, oh, I'm a libertarian, but I always vote Republican. Now, it's funny that you mentioned the crime rate and the criminal indictments in these GOP administrations. But let's go back to one particular thing here. Now, he wanted to say that he mentioned that he was a capitalist. Now, at every point, at almost every instance, almost everyone is a capitalist because they're always, someone is trying to gain footage.
Well, the actual definition, James, of somebody who is a capitalist, rather than, because I think what he meant was he believes in capitalism, but somebody who is a capitalist is a person who lives off of capital. In other words, they live off their investments. There are very few capitalists in the United States. There's probably a couple 100,000 people who have enough money in their investments that they can just live off the dividends that they get from their investments. Those are the capitalists.
Okay, so now we have capitalists who own the oil companies.
All right.
Or benefiting from those investments.
Yep.
That are gouging us to the point that they understand, and they know that they can lower the prices. It was just like with the housing bubble when they recreated mortgage-backed securities. They could have just as well not have done that if they, said, hey, this is not going to work, and left the interest rates where it was, but they didn't do that.
All right.
So it was a gain, and a win-win situation for them, whether the people kept their houses or lost them. It's just like now. What we're dealing with now when it comes to gas and oil prices is what the market will bear. Because people have to have it, they charge them these exorbitant prices, and they pay it.
Oh, the market will bear a lot. I mean, in Europe, gas prices have been over $10 a gallon for a decade.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, this is what we're looking at. It's just as simple as they raised the prices. They could have lowered the prices, too.
Yeah, I'm with you. It is an industry that is acting in its own self-interest, which is what industries are supposed to do. The problem is that its interests do not correspond with the interests of Americans right now, or the interests of life on, in the future of the planet Earth. James, thank you for the call. Jose in Killeen, Texas. Hey, Jose, what's up?
Yeah, how you doing? Hey, in reference to Trump and all this stuff that he's got, or him and his people took from the White House, and then I was looking on MSNBC, and they got a big old, I seen a big old 18-wheeler parked in front of his house there, and I mean it's full of stuff apparently, and I'm so curious how this man and his people are getting away with this. I mean, it's ridiculous.
They stole everything that wasn't nailed down. I mean, including top secret documents. I mean, gifts, memorabilia, statuary, paintings. I mean, Trump made off with all this stuff, and now the Congress is trying to get an audit, a listing of it, and the GSA is like, well, we haven't finished yet, or we can't give that to you yet, or maybe.
Well, how long does it take?
I know. I know. They need to send. They need to send some good burglary cops in there. Get the burglary cops in the New York Police Department down there.
Yeah, and then the DOJ, he should be on that.
Yeah.
I mean, he should be on top of that, like white on rice.
Yeah. Where is CSI when you need it? Jose, spot on. I'm with you. I do have to move along, though. Thank you. Jenny in Miami Beach, Florida. Hey, Jenny, what's up?
Hi, Tom. How are you? I'm actually out of the country. I'm in Argentina for a while.
Oh, my goodness.
From pretty far away, but I was like keeping up with your show.
Well, we have 45 seconds, Jenny.
Sounds good. I wanted to mention, as a little bit of a side note, I study numerology. And very interestingly enough, the next time that when the 24 presidential election comes on, Trump is going to be under the same numerology in which he won the prior election.
Oh my.
So I think there's a very strong chance that he's going to win again. And I think we really need to think about what are we doing in terms of laws to prepare for him.
Oh, to get ready for Trump. Yeah, that's a big issue, Jenny. And to the best of my knowledge, they haven't done much to Trump-proof, the executive branch. Thank you for the call. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires all of us to work. Yes, that's why it's called democracy. So get out there, get active. There's so much you can do. Tag you're it. Have a great afternoon. Be good to yourself and the people around you. And say a prayer for peace in the world, if you're inclined. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
These companies support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at HelloFresh.com, code TOM. The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy by Thom Hartmann. More information at all book outlets. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskancompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at cozyearth.com, promo code TOM. The latest views and opinions from U.S. politics and other fascinating subjects too, including cutting-edge science reports at HartmannReport.com. And Dinovite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at Dinovite.com.